Case 1. Marilyn Lemak, the doctor's wife who chose murder. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. On the night of March 6, 2000, in the affluent Chicago suburb of Naperville, Illinois, a 911 call shattered the peaceful evening. Marilyn Lemak, a 41-year-old nurse, reported that her 3 children were not breathing. When emergency responders rushed to the upscale home on Warwick Court, they discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. Nicholas, age 7, Emily, age 6, and Thomas, age 3, were found in their beds. All 3 children had been suffocated to death. But this wasn't a tragic accident or an intruder's violent act. This was calculated murder committed by the one person who should have protected them above all else: their mother. Marilyn Lemak's story begins not with poverty or desperation, but with privilege and education. Born Marilyn Lena Lewis in the suburbs of Chicago, she grew up in a middle-class family with aspirations for success. She pursued nursing, eventually working in the psychiatric unit at Edward Hospital in Naperville, where she gained extensive knowledge of mental health conditions and medications. It was through her work in healthcare that she met David Lemak, a successful physician. Their marriage in the late 1980s appeared picture-perfect from the outside. David's medical practice thrived, providing the family with financial security and social standing in Naperville's tight-knit professional community. They purchased a beautiful home, had 3 healthy children, and seemed to embody the American dream. Neighbors described Marilyn as a devoted mother who attended every school function, organized playdates, and maintained an immaculate household. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun forming in the Lemak marriage years before that fatal March night. David Lemak had begun an affair with another woman, a relationship that had grown serious enough that he wanted a divorce. When he finally told Marilyn about the affair and his intention to leave the marriage in December of 1999, something inside her snapped. Friends and family later recalled how Marilyn's demeanor changed after learning about the affair. She became withdrawn, obsessive about the divorce proceedings, and fixated on the idea that David would take her children away from her. Despite having no evidence that David sought sole custody, in fact, he wanted shared parenting arrangements, Marilyn became convinced that divorce would mean losing her children entirely. In the months leading up to the murders, Marilyn's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She made dramatic statements to friends, saying things like, "If I can't have them, no one can, and they're better off with me than with him and that woman." These weren't idle threats, though few recognized them as such at the time. Marilyn was methodically planning the unthinkable. On March 6, 2000, David was working an overnight shift at the hospital. Marilyn waited until he left, knowing she would have the entire night alone with the children. She followed her normal evening routine: dinner, baths, bedtime stories, maintaining the facade of the loving mother one final time. But after tucking each child into bed, she enacted her horrifying plan. Using her nursing knowledge, Marilyn had acquired various medications. She gave each child what she later claimed were sedatives to help them sleep, though forensic evidence would later complicate this narrative. Then, one by one, she entered each child's room and suffocated them with pillows. Nicholas, her eldest, was 7 years old and had just lost his first tooth. Emily, her only daughter, was 6 and loved ballet lessons. Thomas, her baby, was only 3 years old, still sleeping in a toddler bed decorated with cartoon characters. After killing all 3 children, Marilyn swallowed a massive overdose of pills in an apparent effort to end her own life. She wanted the family to be found together, dead, with a note she'd prepared explaining that she couldn't bear for her children to grow up in a broken home. But her attempt at self-destruction failed. Her body metabolized the drugs, and as dawn approached, she realized she would survive. That's when she made the 911 call, claiming she'd found her children not breathing and didn't know what had happened. But investigators immediately grew suspicious. The scene was too staged, too clean. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder, and Marilyn's story kept changing under questioning. Within hours, detectives had focused their investigation solely on Marilyn. They discovered the suicide note, found evidence of the medications she'd administered, and uncovered her increasingly desperate statements to friends in the weeks before the murders. By the end of that terrible day, Marilyn Lemak was under arrest for 3 counts of first-degree murder. The trial that followed gripped the Chicago area for months. Marilyn's defense team attempted to argue that she'd suffered a psychotic break, that the stress of the impending divorce had caused a complete mental collapse. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about depression, anxiety, and adjustment disorders. They painted Marilyn as a victim herself, a woman driven to temporary insanity by her husband's betrayal. But prosecutors methodically dismantled this defense. They demonstrated that Marilyn had been planning the murders for weeks, if not months. She'd researched medications, practiced her alibi, and written detailed notes, all actions inconsistent with a spontaneous psychotic break. They argued that this was calculated revenge against David, with the children used as weapons in a marital dispute. Most damningly, they presented evidence that Marilyn had attempted to make it appear as though David might be responsible, crafting a narrative that would destroy him even as she destroyed herself. The jury heard testimony from devastated family members, friends who'd noticed Marilyn's declining mental state but never imagined she'd harm her children, and medical experts who explained exactly how each child had died. Forensic pathologists testified that the children had struggled against the suffocation, that they'd experienced terror in their final moments. This wasn't peaceful euthanasia as Marilyn's defenders tried to suggest. This was violent murder. On May 24, 2001, after deliberating for just 7 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdicts were read, Marilyn showed no emotion, sitting stone-faced at the defense table while David Lemak sobbed openly in the courtroom gallery. During the sentencing phase, David Lemak delivered a victim impact statement that brought the courtroom to tears. He described the unbearable pain of losing his children, the guilt he carried for not recognizing Marilyn's capacity for violence, and the life sentence he would serve knowing his children died because of an argument between their parents. He asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence, saying that Marilyn had forfeited any right to mercy when she stole the lives of 3 innocent children. Judge George Bacallis agreed. On July 27, 2001, he sentenced Marilyn Lemak to life in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each child she murdered. As she was led from the courtroom in shackles, Marilyn finally broke down, weeping and calling out for her dead children. Marilyn Lemak is currently incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where she will remain for the rest of her natural life. She's now in her mid-60s, having spent more than 2 decades behind bars. Appeals have been denied at every level, with appellate courts consistently finding that the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming and that no legal errors occurred during her trial. The Lemak case sent shockwaves through Naperville and the broader Chicago metropolitan area. It shattered the myth that familicide, the murder of one's own family members, only happens in economically desperate situations or among the uneducated. Here was a middle-class, college-educated healthcare professional who'd slaughtered her own children in one of America's safest, most affluent suburbs. The case also sparked intense debate about divorce, custody, and mental health. Many asked why Marilyn hadn't sought help, why friends and family hadn't intervened more forcefully when they noticed her deteriorating mental state, and whether the family court system's approach to custody disputes needs reform. Some advocates argued that better mental health screening during divorce proceedings might prevent such tragedies, though others pointed out that Marilyn had deliberately hidden the depths of her rage and planning. David Lemak eventually remarried and attempted to rebuild his life, though he stated in interviews that he thinks about Nicholas, Emily, and Thomas every single day. He established a memorial fund in their names and has become an advocate for domestic violence awareness, speaking about how divorce-related violence can take many forms and affect families of any socioeconomic background. The Naperville community came together in the aftermath of the murders, with hundreds attending funeral services for the 3 children. Their elementary school established a memorial garden, and classmates who survived them are now adults themselves, many still carrying memories of the bright, happy children who were stolen from them by their own mother's hand. The Lemak case remains one of Illinois' most disturbing examples of maternal filicide, the murder of children by their mother. It's a stark reminder that evil doesn't always look like poverty, ignorance, or obvious dysfunction. Sometimes it looks like a successful family in a beautiful home in a safe neighborhood. And that, perhaps, is what makes it most terrifying of all. Case 2. Amanda Hamm, the Clinton Lake drownings. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. On September 3, 2003, the small central Illinois town of Clinton was rocked by a tragedy that would soon reveal itself to be something far more sinister than a terrible accident. Amanda Hamm, a 27-year-old mother of 3, reported that her children had drowned in Clinton Lake while the family was visiting the shore for a late summer outing. Christopher, age 6, Austin, age 3, and Kylie, only 23 months old, were pulled from the water by emergency responders who fought desperately to revive them. Despite heroic efforts, all 3 children were pronounced deceased at the scene. Initially, the community rallied around Amanda, offering sympathy and support to a grieving mother who'd lost everything in what appeared to be a horrific accident. But investigators weren't convinced. Something about Amanda's story didn't add up, and the more they dug, the more suspicious they became. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was cold-blooded murder disguised as a drowning. Amanda Hamm grew up in central Illinois, the product of a troubled childhood marked by instability and poor relationships. She dropped out of high school and had her first child, Christopher, when she was 20 years old. The boy's father wasn't involved in his life, and Amanda struggled with single parenthood, moving frequently and working low-wage jobs that barely covered expenses. She later became involved with Maurice Legrone Jr., a relationship that produced 2 more children, Austin and Kylie. But this relationship was tumultuous from the start, characterized by frequent breakups and reconciliations, financial stress, and Amanda's growing resentment toward the responsibilities of motherhood. Friends and family later recalled that Amanda often complained about being trapped by her children, saying she felt like she'd missed out on her youth and freedom. By the summer of 2003, Amanda's relationship with Maurice had deteriorated completely. They were no longer living together, and Maurice had begun seeing another woman, Tabitha, someone Amanda viewed as a rival for Maurice's affections and, more importantly, his financial support. Amanda became obsessed with winning Maurice back, convinced that her children were the obstacle preventing a reconciliation. In the weeks before the drownings, Amanda's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She left her children with various friends and relatives for extended periods, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. She made disturbing comments about how her life would be so much easier without the kids, and how Maurice would come back to her if she didn't have all this baggage. Multiple people later testified that Amanda had openly discussed wanting to be free of her children, though most dismissed these comments as the frustrated venting of an overwhelmed single mother. What those friends and family members didn't realize was that Amanda was planning murder. On September 3, 2003, Amanda loaded her 3 children into her car and drove to Clinton Lake, a popular recreational area about 10 miles west of Clinton, Illinois. She told her mother she was taking the kids for a fun afternoon outing, maybe letting them play in the shallow water along the shore. It was a warm late summer day, and the lake area was relatively quiet on that Wednesday afternoon. But Amanda had no intention of letting her children play. According to the evidence later presented at trial, she drove to a secluded area of the lake where she knew she'd be unlikely to encounter other visitors. She took the children down to the water's edge, and then, one by one, she drowned them. Kylie, the youngest at just 23 months old, was first. Amanda held her baby daughter under the water until she stopped struggling. Then came Austin, age 3, who cried and fought as his mother pushed him beneath the surface. Finally, Christopher, age 6 and the oldest, realized what was happening. He tried to run, tried to escape his mother's grasp, but Amanda was stronger. She drowned her firstborn son in the shallow waters of Clinton Lake while he begged for his life. After all 3 children were dead, Amanda pulled their lifeless bodies to shore and arranged them carefully. Then she called 911, claiming she'd turned her back for just a moment, and when she looked again, all 3 children had somehow wandered into the water and drowned. She played the role of hysterical, devastated mother perfectly when emergency responders arrived, screaming and crying, begging them to save her babies. But investigators immediately recognized problems with Amanda's account. First, the children's bodies showed no signs of the typical struggle associated with accidental drowning. No water in the lungs beyond what would be expected, no debris under fingernails, no defensive wounds. Second, The logistics of Amanda's story made no sense. How could three children of different ages and abilities all accidentally drown in relatively shallow water within moments of each other while their mother's back was turned? Third, witnesses came forward who'd seen Amanda's car parked at that secluded location for much longer than she'd claimed, suggesting she'd spent considerable time at the lake, not just the few minutes her story required. Most damningly, forensic pathologists determined that the children hadn't drowned simultaneously. They died at different times over a period of at least 15 to 20 minutes. This meant that even if one child had accidentally drowned, Amanda would have had time to call for help before the others died. Instead, she'd systematically murdered each child while their siblings watched and waited. As detectives interviewed Amanda repeatedly over the following days, her story changed constantly. She contradicted herself, added new details, and removed others. She claimed she'd been distracted by a phone call, then said there was no phone call. She said the children had been playing together, then said they'd wandered off separately. Nothing she said held up under scrutiny. Investigators also uncovered Amanda's obsession with Maurice Legrone and his new girlfriend. They found journal entries where Amanda had written about needing to start fresh and remove obstacles to get Maurice back. They discovered internet search history on her computer showing that she'd researched drowning, how long it takes for someone to drown, and whether drowning can be distinguished from homicide. This evidence of premeditation would prove crucial at trial. On September 10, 2003, just 1 week after the drownings, Amanda Hamm was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. She maintained her innocence, claiming that investigators were railroading a grieving mother because they couldn't accept that such a tragedy could be accidental. Amanda's trial began in the spring of 2005 in DeWitt County Circuit Court. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, motive, and opportunity. They called Maurice Legrone to testify about Amanda's obsession with winning him back and her statements about the children being obstacles to their relationship. They presented Amanda's disturbing internet searches and journal entries. They brought in forensic experts who explained exactly how each child had died and why the physical evidence contradicted Amanda's accident narrative. The defense attempted to argue that Amanda was mentally ill, suffering from depression and possibly psychosis that prevented her from understanding her actions. They presented psychiatric experts who diagnosed Amanda with various mental health conditions. But prosecutors countered with evidence that Amanda had been lucid and calculating in her planning, that she'd deliberately chosen a secluded location, and that she'd attempted to stage the scene to look like an accident. This wasn't the behavior of someone in a psychotic state. This was calculated murder. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Christopher's kindergarten teacher testified about the bright, loving little boy who'd been excited to start first grade just weeks after his death. She broke down on the witness stand describing Christopher's enthusiasm for learning and his protective love for his younger siblings. The jury, many of whom were parents themselves, visibly struggled to maintain composure. On May 13, 2005, the jury found Amanda Hamm guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdicts were read, Amanda collapsed at the defense table, wailing and proclaiming her innocence. But for the prosecution and for the families of those 3 murdered children, justice had finally been served. During sentencing, Maurice Legrone gave a victim impact statement in which he expressed profound guilt for not recognizing the danger Amanda posed to their children. He admitted that he'd been so focused on his new relationship that he'd ignored warning signs about Amanda's deteriorating mental state and her resentment toward the children. He told the court that he would carry the weight of his children's deaths for the rest of his life, and he begged the judge to ensure that Amanda never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. Judge Stephen Peters sentenced Amanda Hamm to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He stated from the bench that her crimes were among the most heinous he'd encountered in his judicial career, noting that she'd betrayed the fundamental bond between mother and child in the most violent way imaginable. Amanda Hamm is currently serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Now in her late 40s, she has filed numerous appeals over the years, all of which have been denied. She continues to maintain her innocence, claiming that she's the victim of a rush to judgment by investigators who needed someone to blame for a terrible accident. But the evidence speaks for itself. 3 children who should have grown up, gone to school, fallen in love, and lived full lives were instead murdered by their own mother in the shallow waters of Clinton Lake. Christopher never made it to first grade. Austin never learned to ride a bike. Kylie never spoke her first full sentence. Their lives were stolen by the person who should have protected them above all others. The Clinton community was devastated by the murders. The small town, where everyone knows everyone else, struggled to comprehend how such evil could exist among them. A memorial was established near the lake, though it's been moved several times due to the painful memories it evokes. Many residents avoid that section of Clinton Lake entirely, the beautiful natural area now forever tainted by the memory of what happened there. The Hamm case highlights a disturbing pattern that appears in many cases of maternal filicide, the mother who views her children as obstacles to romantic relationships or personal freedom. Amanda Hamm saw Christopher, Austin, and Kylie not as the precious gifts they were, but as burdens preventing her from living the life she wanted. Rather than finding healthy ways to address her feelings through therapy, by asking for help with childcare, or by simply accepting the responsibilities she'd taken on by becoming a parent, she chose the ultimate act of selfishness and violence. The case also demonstrates how premeditated these murders often are. Despite defense attempts to portray maternal filicide as the result of sudden mental breaks or uncontrollable impulses, the evidence in Amanda's case showed extensive planning and calculation. She researched methods, chose a location, and carefully staged the scene to appear accidental. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was cold-blooded murder planned and executed with chilling precision. Today, the names Christopher Hamm, Austin LeGrone, and Kylie LeGrone are inscribed on a memorial stone in Clinton's Woodlawn Cemetery. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or small toys, honoring the children whose lives were cut short by unfathomable evil. Their father, Maurice LeGrone, has since remarried and had other children, but he stated in interviews that he thinks about his first 3 children every single day and carries guilt that will never fade. The shallow waters of Clinton Lake continue to lap against the shore where 3 children took their last breaths, murdered by the woman who gave them life. It stands as a somber reminder that sometimes the greatest danger to a child comes not from strangers or accidents, but from the person who should be their ultimate protector, their mother. Case 3. Tonya Vasilev, the Schaumburg stabbing. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. In the quiet Chicago suburb of Schaumburg, Illinois, residents prided themselves on living in one of the state's safest and most family-friendly communities. With excellent schools, low crime rates, and well-maintained neighborhoods, it seemed like an ideal place to raise children. But on October 19, 2005, that sense of security was shattered when Tonya Vasilev committed an act so brutal that it still haunts the community nearly 2 decades later. Tonya Vasilev, a 34-year-old Bulgarian immigrant and mother of 3, stabbed her 7-year-old daughter Jillian to death in their Schaumburg apartment. But the horror didn't end there. She also seriously injured her 5-year-old daughter Lindsay in the attack. When police arrived at the scene, they found a bloodbath that veteran officers described as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they'd ever encountered. To understand how Tonya Vasilev became a killer, we need to go back to her early life in Bulgaria. Born in Sofia in 1971, Tonya grew up during the final years of communist rule in Bulgaria, a time of economic hardship and political uncertainty. She was described by childhood friends as quiet and intelligent, but also prone to mood swings and periods of depression. After completing her education, she worked various jobs in Bulgaria but struggled to find stability or satisfaction. In the late 1990s, Tonya met Miroslav Vasilev, an American citizen of Bulgarian descent who was visiting family in Sofia. They began a whirlwind romance, and within months, Tonya had married Miroslav and moved to the United States, settling in the Chicago suburbs where Miroslav worked as a software engineer. The marriage produced 3 daughters, Jillian, born in 1998, Lindsay, born in 2000, and a 3rd daughter born in 2003. From the outside, the Vasilev family appeared to be living the American dream. They lived in a comfortable apartment in Schaumburg, the children attended good schools, and Miroslav's income provided financial security. But behind closed doors, serious problems plagued the family. Tonya struggled with the transition to American life. She had difficulty learning English, felt isolated from her family back in Bulgaria, and found it hard to make friends in their suburban community. Cultural differences created tension in her marriage. Miroslav had been raised in the United States and expected a partnership based on American norms, while Tonya had been raised with more traditional Eastern European gender role expectations. More significantly, Tonya battled severe mental health issues that went largely untreated. Friends and family members later testified that she'd exhibited symptoms of depression and anxiety for years, but she'd refused professional help. In Bulgarian culture, mental illness carried significant stigma, and Tonya viewed psychiatric treatment as shameful. She insisted she could handle her problems on her own, even as those around her grew increasingly concerned. By 2005, the Vasilev marriage was crumbling. Miroslav had grown frustrated with Tonya's refusal to seek help for her mental health issues and her increasing isolation. Tonya, meanwhile, felt abandoned and misunderstood. She became convinced that Miroslav was planning to divorce her and take the children back to Bulgaria, leaving her alone in America. This fear, largely unfounded according to Miroslav's later testimony, became an obsession. In the months before the murder, Tonya's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She became paranoid, accusing Miroslav of having affairs and plotting against her. She stopped taking care of the apartment, neglected her personal hygiene, and began having increasingly bizarre conversations with the few friends she still maintained contact with. She talked about protecting her children from evil and saving them from a terrible fate. Most concerning, she made statements suggesting that death would be preferable to separation from her daughters. On October 19, 2005, Miroslav was at work when Tonya's darkest fears and delusions came to a terrible head. The children came home from school that afternoon to what should have been a normal Wednesday. Their mother made them a snack, helped with homework, and everything seemed routine. But as the afternoon wore on, something inside Tonya snapped. According to Lindsay's later testimony, given when she was old enough to discuss what happened, her mother had become increasingly agitated as evening approached. Tonya kept saying that she needed to protect them and that they couldn't stay here anymore. Lindsay, only 5 years old, didn't understand what her mother meant, but she sensed that something was terribly wrong. When Miroslav didn't come home at his usual time, he'd stayed late at work to finish a project. Tonya's paranoid delusions intensified. She became convinced that he wasn't coming back, that he'd already left for Bulgaria with plans to return for the children, and that she needed to act immediately to prevent him from taking her daughters away. Around 7 o'clock that evening, while the youngest daughter was in another room, Tonya took a large kitchen knife and attacked 7-year-old Jillian. The child never had a chance to defend herself. Tonya stabbed her daughter multiple times in the chest and abdomen with such force that several wounds penetrated completely through the child's small body. Jillian died quickly, though not instantly, a fact that would haunt investigators and prosecutors. 5-year-old Lindsay witnessed her sister's murder and tried to run. She made it to the apartment door and was attempting to unlock it when Tonya caught her and began stabbing her as well. Lindsay sustained multiple serious wounds to her back, arms, and legs as she tried desperately to protect herself and escape. In a remarkable act of survival, Lindsay managed to wrench free from her mother's grasp and squeeze through a partially open door, running down the apartment hallway while screaming for help. Neighbors called 911 after hearing Lindsay's screams and finding the blood-covered child in the hallway. When police arrived minutes later, they found Lindsay being comforted by neighbors while Tonya stood in the doorway of the apartment, covered in blood and calmly stating that she'd protected her children from evil. Inside the apartment, officers discovered Jillian's body on the living room floor in a massive pool of blood. The youngest daughter was found unharmed in her bedroom, where she'd apparently remained throughout the attack. The crime scene was so horrific that several officers required counseling afterward. Tonya was immediately taken into custody. She showed no emotion and didn't resist arrest. When questioned by detectives, she gave rambling statements about needing to save her daughters from an unspecified threat, repeatedly referencing her husband's alleged plans to take the children to Bulgaria. She showed no remorse for killing Jillian and seemed confused about why police were treating her as a criminal rather than a protective mother. Miroslav Vasilev arrived home from work to find his street blocked by police vehicles and his family's lives destroyed. When informed that his 7-year-old daughter had been murdered and his 5-year-old seriously injured, both by their own mother, he collapsed. In the days and weeks that followed, he struggled to comprehend how the woman he'd married had transformed into a monster capable of such violence. Tonya Vasilev was charged with first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and aggravated battery of a child. Her defense attorneys immediately raised the issue of mental illness, arguing that Tonya had been suffering from severe postpartum depression that had never been properly treated, along with possible schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. They sought to have her found not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial, which took place in Cook County Circuit Court in 2007, became a complex battle between competing psychiatric experts. The defense presented evidence of Tonya's deteriorating mental state, her delusional thinking, and her genuine belief that she was protecting her children from harm. They argued that she'd been in the grip of a psychotic episode and couldn't distinguish right from wrong at the time of the attack. Prosecutors, however, argued that mental illness didn't equal legal insanity. They pointed out that Tonya had waited until Miroslav was gone to commit her crimes, suggesting consciousness of guilt. They noted that she'd hidden the knife afterward and that she'd made statements to neighbors in the weeks before the murder indicating awareness that harming children was wrong. Most importantly, they emphasized that even if Tonya believed her delusions, she'd still made a choice to respond to those delusions with violence. The jury heard gut-wrenching testimony from Lindsay Vasilev, who was by then 7 years old. Speaking through tears, she described watching her mother kill her sister and then trying to kill her. She showed the jury her scars, permanent reminders of the day her mother betrayed the most fundamental obligation of parenthood. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Miroslav Vasilev's testimony was equally emotional. He described feeling profound guilt for not recognizing the severity of Tonya's mental illness and not forcing her into treatment. He talked about the impossible situation of loving someone who'd murdered your child, of wanting to support your sick spouse, while also seeking justice for your dead daughter. He told the jury that whatever Tonya's mental state, Jillian deserved justice and Lindsay deserved protection. On August 14, 2007, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. They'd rejected the insanity defense, finding that while Tonya was mentally ill, she'd been capable of understanding that killing her daughter was wrong. When the verdict was announced, Tonya showed no reaction, staring blankly ahead while her attorneys sat in stunned silence. During sentencing, the judge heard impact statements from Miroslav and from Lindsay, now 8 years old. Lindsay told the court that she had nightmares every night about her sister's murder and her own near death. She said she missed Jillian every day and would never understand why her mother had done this. Miroslav asked for the maximum possible sentence, stating that Tonya had forfeited any claim to mercy when she plunged a knife into their innocent daughter. Judge Vincent Gahn sentenced Tonya Vasilev to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Jillian's murder, plus an additional 30 years for the attempted murder of Lindsay. He stated from the bench that while he acknowledged Tonya's mental illness, he couldn't overlook the brutal nature of her crimes or the lifelong trauma she'd inflicted on her surviving daughter. Tonya Vasilev is currently incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Now in her early 50s, she's received mental health treatment during her incarceration and has reportedly stabilized on medication. She's expressed remorse for her actions, though it's unclear whether this remorse stems from genuine understanding of her crime or from her improved mental state, allowing her to recognize that what she did was wrong. Lindsay Vasilev, now an adult, has struggled with the trauma of her childhood. She's undergone years of therapy and physical rehabilitation for her injuries. Miroslav raised her and her younger sister, who was too young to remember the events of that day, as a single parent, later remarrying a woman who helped provide stability for the family. Miroslav has spoken publicly about the importance of mental health treatment and the need for better support systems for immigrant families who may not understand or have access to mental health resources. The Schaumburg community was profoundly affected by Jillian's murder. The elementary school she attended held memorial services, and classmates who'd known her still remember the bright, cheerful girl who loved art class and playing on the swings. A scholarship fund was established in Jillian's name to support children pursuing art education. The Vasilev case raises difficult questions about mental illness, personal responsibility, and the legal system's capacity to address cases where severe psychiatric disease intersects with violent crime. Tonya Vasilev was clearly mentally ill. Few dispute this fact. But the question the jury had to answer wasn't whether she was sick, but whether her sickness absolved her of legal responsibility for taking her daughter's life. The case also highlights the particular challenges faced by immigrant women who may struggle with cultural adjustment, language barriers, and isolation. Had Tonya received proper mental health treatment earlier, might Jillian still be alive? Would better community support systems for immigrant families have identified Tonya's deteriorating condition before it reached a crisis point? These questions continue to be debated by mental health professionals and immigrant advocacy groups. But for Miroslav and Lindsay Vasilev, these broader policy debates offer little comfort. They live every day with the reality that Jillian is gone, murdered by her own mother in an act of unfathomable violence. A family that should have been complete, 5 people with a lifetime ahead of them, was instead torn apart in a few minutes of horror on an October evening in 2005. Jillian Vasilev's short life ended at age 7, in her own home, at the hands of her own mother. Her name is carved on a memorial stone in a Schaumburg cemetery, a permanent reminder of a beautiful child whose life was stolen by maternal evil dressed up in the guise of mental illness. Before we continue with more cases, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. These stories need to be told, and your support helps us continue bringing you thoroughly researched, respectful coverage of true crime cases. Drop a comment letting us know what you think so far. We read every single one, and your engagement helps more people find these important stories. Case 4. Nicole Dively, The Christmas Eve Horror. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. Christmas Eve should be a time of joy, anticipation, and family togetherness. Children dream of Santa's arrival, families gather for holiday meals, and communities celebrate the season. But on Christmas Eve of 2011, in the town of Harvard, Illinois, Nicole Dively turned what should have been a magical night into a nightmare of unthinkable horror. Nicole Dively, a 31-year-old mother of 4, stabbed her 14-year-old daughter Brianna Dively and her 11-year-old daughter Brooklyn Dively to death in their McHenry County home. The brutal double murder shocked the small community of Harvard, a quiet town of 9,000 people near the Wisconsin border where serious violent crime was virtually unheard of. Nicole Dively's life had been marked by instability and poor choices from an early age. Born in 1980 in rural Illinois, Nicole grew up in a troubled household where substance use and domestic violence were common. She dropped out of high school in her sophomore year and had her first child at 17. Over the next decade, she had 3 more children by different fathers, none of whom remained consistently involved in their children's lives. By her late 20s, Nicole was a single mother of 4 struggling to make ends meet. She worked sporadic low-wage jobs, but could never maintain steady employment. The family moved frequently, bouncing between rental homes and occasionally staying with relatives or in homeless shelters. The children, Brianna, Brooklyn, and 2 younger siblings, experienced significant instability, changing schools frequently and never quite fitting in anywhere. Despite these challenges, Brianna and Brooklyn were described by teachers and neighbors as remarkably resilient children. Brianna, the eldest at 14, had taken on significant caregiving responsibilities for her younger siblings, often preparing meals and getting them ready for school when Nicole was absent or incapacitated. Brooklyn, 11 years old, was described as creative and kind, always drawing pictures and leaving them as gifts for neighbors and classmates. But Nicole's parenting grew increasingly erratic over the years. She began using methamphetamine regularly, a habit that accelerated her descent into chaos. Child Protective Services had been called to investigate the family on multiple occasions, and there had been discussions about removing the children from Nicole's custody. But each time, Nicole managed to convince caseworkers that she was getting her life together, that things would improve, and the children remained in her care. By December of 2011, Nicole's drug use had spiraled completely out of control. She was using methamphetamine daily, sometimes staying awake for days at a time before crashing into deep, unresponsive sleep. Her behavior became paranoid and aggressive. She accused neighbors of spying on her, believed that the government was monitoring her family, and became convinced that her children were plotting against her or working with her enemies. Friends and family members later testified that Nicole's statements about her children had become increasingly disturbing in the weeks before Christmas. She told one friend that Brianna was too controlling and thought she could run things better. She complained that Brooklyn was always crying and making life harder. Most chilling, she told her mother that she sometimes wished she could just start over without all these kids dragging me down. On Christmas Eve of 2011, Nicole was at home with all 4 of her children in their rental house on West Washington Street in Harvard. According to the 2 younger children who survived, their mother had been acting strangely all day, pacing around the house, muttering to herself, and looking through windows as if expecting someone to arrive. As evening fell and darkness settled over Harvard, families throughout the town were gathering for Christmas Eve celebrations. Children were excitedly laying out cookies for Santa, parents were wrapping last-minute gifts, and churches were holding candlelight services. But in the Dively household, something terrible was building. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Nicole sent her 2 youngest children to their bedroom and told them to stay there no matter what they heard. The children, ages 7 and 5, obeyed, though they were confused about why their mother seemed so angry and why they weren't doing their usual Christmas Eve traditions. What happened next remains difficult to fully reconstruct, but the evidence suggests that Nicole armed herself with a large kitchen knife and attacked her 2 eldest daughters. Brianna was in her bedroom wrapping a small gift she'd made for her younger siblings when Nicole entered and began stabbing her. The 14-year-old fought desperately for her life, sustaining defensive wounds to her hands and arms as she tried to protect herself from her mother's attack. But Nicole was in the grip of a violent rage, possibly fueled by her methamphetamine use, and she overpowered her daughter. Brianna Dively died from multiple stab wounds to her chest, neck, and face. Brooklyn, who'd been in the bathroom, heard the commotion and emerged to find her mother standing over Brianna's body. The 11-year-old understood immediately what had happened and tried to run. She made it to the living room before Nicole caught her and began stabbing her as well. Brooklyn screamed for her younger siblings to help, but they'd been trained to obey their mother and remained in their bedroom as instructed. Brooklyn Dively died from massive trauma to her chest and abdomen, her small body no match for her mother's violent assault. After killing both daughters, Nicole walked through the house in a daze, still holding the bloody knife. The 2 younger children, terrified by the screams they'd heard, had locked their bedroom door. Nicole tried the handle, found it locked, and instead of trying to force her way in, she simply left the house. She walked through the quiet streets of Harvard, still covered in her daughter's blood, until she reached a neighbor's house several blocks away. She knocked on the door and, when the stunned neighbor answered, calmly stated that she'd taken care of the problem and needed someone to call the police. Officers arrived within minutes to find Nicole sitting on the neighbor's front steps, covered in blood and showing no emotion. When asked what problem she'd taken care of, she stated matter-of-factly that her daughters had been threatening her and she'd had to protect herself. She made no attempt to flee and surrendered without resistance. Police immediately went to the Dively home, where they discovered the horrific crime scene. Brianna and Brooklyn were both deceased, their bodies showing clear evidence of brutal knife attacks. The 2 younger children were found locked in their bedroom, traumatized but physically unharmed. They were immediately taken into protective custody. The Harvard community woke up on Christmas morning to news that would haunt them for years. 2 young girls had been brutally murdered in their own home by their own mother on the night before Christmas. Shock and grief rippled through the small town. Many residents had known the Dively girls from school or neighborhood interactions. The thought that such horror could happen in their quiet community, and on Christmas Eve, no less, was almost impossible to process. Nicole Dively was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During her initial court appearances, she showed little emotion and seemed disconnected from reality. She made bizarre statements about having been under attack and needing to eliminate threats to her survival. Psychiatric evaluations quickly determined that while Nicole had significant mental health issues exacerbated by her methamphetamine use, she was competent to stand trial. The legal proceedings stretched on for nearly 2 years as Nicole's defense team attempted various strategies. They tried to argue diminished capacity due to drug-induced psychosis. They presented evidence of Nicole's troubled childhood and suggested that her own trauma had contributed to her actions. They brought in experts to testify about the effects of chronic methamphetamine use on judgment and impulse control. But prosecutors had a straightforward case. Nicole had deliberately armed herself with a lethal weapon, attacked her daughters in separate incidents, suggesting premeditation rather than a single moment of lost control, and had shown enough awareness of wrongdoing to leave the house afterward and tell someone to call police. The fact that she'd spared her two younger children also suggested that her actions weren't the result of a complete psychotic break, but rather a conscious choice about which children to kill. The trial took place in McHenry County Circuit Court in the spring of 2013. The prosecution presented forensic evidence showing the brutality of the attacks, with both girls suffering multiple stab wounds that indicated prolonged assaults rather than momentary violence. They called the two surviving children to testify, now ages 9 and 7, who described hearing their sister's screams and their mother's angry voice. Neighbors and teachers testified about the girls' characters. Brianna's English teacher broke down on the witness stand describing how Brianna had written an essay about wanting to go to college so she could make a better life for herself and her siblings. Brooklyn's art teacher showed the jury some of the drawings Brooklyn had made, including one depicting a happy family with a mother who smiled, a vision of family life that Brooklyn had apparently longed for but never experienced. The most damning testimony came from Nicole herself. Against her attorney's advice, she took the stand and gave rambling, incoherent statements about how her daughters had betrayed her and how she'd had no choice but to kill them. She showed no remorse and seemed unable to grasp the enormity of what she'd done. At one point, she expressed frustration that people were making such a big deal out of her actions when she'd only been protecting herself. On May 23, 2013, the jury found Nicole Dively guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The verdicts came after just 4 hours of deliberation, suggesting the jury had little difficulty reaching its conclusion. When the verdicts were read, Nicole stared straight ahead, showing no reaction whatsoever. During the sentencing phase, the surviving children's foster parents read victim impact statements on their behalf. They described how the two younger children still suffered from severe trauma, how they had nightmares about their sisters' deaths, and how they struggled with the knowledge that their own mother had chosen to kill their siblings. The foster parents asked the judge to ensure that Nicole could never harm anyone again. Judge Thomas Meyer sentenced Nicole Dively to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He stated from the bench that her crimes represented evil in its purest form, the betrayal of the maternal bond and the destruction of innocent life on what should have been a joyful family holiday. He noted that Brianna and Brooklyn had done nothing to deserve their fate except be born to a mother incapable of love. Nicole Dively is currently serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. She's now in her mid-40s and will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Appeals have been unsuccessful, with appellate courts finding that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that no legal errors occurred during her trial. The 2 surviving Dively children were adopted by their foster family and have grown up outside of Harvard, away from the memories and publicity surrounding their sisters' murders. They've received extensive therapy and support, but those who work with them say the trauma of that Christmas Eve will likely affect them for the rest of their lives. The Harvard community struggled to heal from the murders. The Dively family's rental home on West Washington Street sat vacant for years before finally being torn down. No one wanted to live in the house where such horror had occurred. Brianna and Brooklyn were buried in a local cemetery, their joint headstone reading, "Forever loved, forever missed." The case sparked intense discussion about Illinois' Child Protective Services system. Multiple investigations revealed that warning signs about Nicole Dively's deteriorating parenting had been present for months, if not years, before the murders. Caseworkers had documented concerns but hadn't taken decisive action to remove the children. In the aftermath, reforms were implemented to try to ensure that vulnerable children would be protected more effectively, though advocates argue that systemic problems remain. The Dively case also highlighted the intersection of substance use, mental illness, and violence. Nicole's methamphetamine addiction had clearly played a role in her deteriorating mental state and her increasingly paranoid, violent behavior. Treatment advocates point to her case as an example of how untreated addiction can have catastrophic consequences. while others argue that Nicole's fundamental character flaws and lack of maternal instinct would have led to tragedy regardless of her drug use. But beyond the policy debates and systemic failures, what remains most stark about this case is the simplest fact. Two young girls who should have been celebrating Christmas were instead brutally murdered by the person who should have been their protector. Brianna and Brooklyn Dively never opened the Christmas presents that were waiting under the tree. They never grew up, never went to prom, never graduated from high school, never fell in love. Their lives ended in terror and pain at the hands of their own mother on the night before Christmas. The case stands as one of Illinois' most disturbing examples of maternal filicide, a stark reminder that family relationships provide no guarantee of safety when mental illness, addiction, and evil intersect in the heart of a parent who's lost all sense of the sacred obligation to protect their children. Case 5. Jennifer Hudson Family Murders. Julia Hudson Case. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. While this case isn't about a mother killing her own children, it's crucial to include in our examination of Illinois' darkest maternal betrayal cases because it involves a mother whose choices led directly to the murder of her young grandson. The 2008 Hudson Family Murders shocked not just Illinois but the entire nation, demonstrating that maternal evil can take many forms, including choosing a dangerous man over the safety of your family. On October 24, 2008, Chicago police discovered a crime scene that would dominate headlines for months. Inside a South Side home on South Yale Avenue, they found the bodies of Darnell Donnerson, age 57, and Jason Hudson, age 29. Darnell, the family matriarch, had been shot multiple times. Jason, her son, had also been gunned down in cold blood. But most horrifying was the missing 7-year-old boy, Julian King, Darnell's grandson and Jason's nephew. The murders and abductions set off an immediate massive search involving local police, the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers. The story gained international attention because Darnell's daughter, Jason's sister, was Jennifer Hudson, the Oscar-winning actress and singer who'd risen to fame through American Idol and Dreamgirls. But this tragedy wasn't about celebrity. It was about family, betrayal, and a mother's catastrophically poor judgment. At the center of the case was Julia Hudson, Jennifer's sister and Julian's mother. Julia's choices and her stubborn refusal to acknowledge danger signs about her estranged husband would lead directly to the slaughter of her mother, her brother, and ultimately her own young son. Julia Hudson had married William Balfour in 2006, despite her family's strong objections. Balfour was a career criminal with a lengthy record including attempted murder, for which he'd served 7 years in prison. He had a reputation for violence, drug dealing, and possessiveness. Darnell Donnerson had told Julia explicitly that Balfour was dangerous and shouldn't be brought into their family, but Julia had married him anyway, convinced that she could change him or that her family was being judgmental. The marriage quickly deteriorated. Balfour was controlling and abusive, and by early 2008, Julia had separated from him and moved back into her mother's South Yale Avenue home with 7-year-old Julian. But Julia refused to completely cut ties with Balfour. Despite obtaining an order of protection, she continued to allow him contact with Julian and even occasionally let him into her mother's home, directly violating the protection order and her mother's explicit rules. Darnell Donnerson repeatedly warned Julia that Balfour was going to hurt someone. She told neighbors and friends that she feared for her family's safety and that she'd confronted Julia multiple times about continuing to see Balfour. Jason Hudson, Julia's brother, had also confronted Balfour directly, warning him to stay away from the family. These warnings would prove tragically prescient. In the months leading up to the murders, Balfour became increasingly enraged that Julia was moving on with her life. She'd started dating another man, and Balfour's jealousy spiraled into obsession. He made threats against Julia and her family, statements that were reported to police but which didn't result in his arrest. He violated the protection order repeatedly, sometimes showing up at Darnell's home and demanding to see Julia or Julian. On October 24, 2008, Balfour's rage finally exploded into violence. He entered the South Yale Avenue home, possibly let in by Julia herself, who later claimed she'd been trying to talk to him about co-parenting Julian. What exactly transpired inside the house remains unclear in some details, but the outcome was devastatingly clear. Balfour shot Darnell Donnerson multiple times, killing the grandmother who'd warned repeatedly that he was dangerous. He then shot Jason Hudson, who tried to defend his mother. With 2 family members dead, Balfour took 7-year-old Julian King and fled in Jason's white SUV. When Julia discovered the bodies of her mother and brother, she immediately knew who was responsible. She told police about Balfour, about the threats he'd made, about his violation of the protection order. But for Julian, this information came too late. An Amber Alert was issued for Julian King, and a massive search effort began. For 3 agonizing days, the Hudson family and the entire Chicago community hoped that the little boy might be found alive. Jennifer Hudson, devastated by her mother and brother's murders, made tearful public pleas for Julian's safe return. Hundreds of volunteers searched Chicago's South Side, checking abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and any place a child might be hidden. On October 27, 2008, the search ended with the discovery every family member had feared. Julian King's body was found in the white SUV, which had been abandoned on Chicago's West Side near Damon Avenue. The 7-year-old had been shot multiple times in the head at close range. He'd been dead since shortly after his abduction, meaning Balfour had killed the child almost immediately after the initial murders. The discovery of Julian's body devastated the community. This wasn't a child caught in crossfire or killed in a moment of chaotic violence. He'd been deliberately executed by his mother's estranged husband, a man who never should have had access to the family in the first place. William Balfour was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of home invasion, and 1 count of kidnapping. He immediately maintained his innocence, claiming he'd been nowhere near the South Yale Avenue home on the day of the murders. But evidence quickly mounted against him. The trial took place in Cook County Circuit Court in the spring of 2012, nearly 4 years after the murders. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Balfour's guilt. Ballistics matched the murder weapon to a gun Balfour had access to. Cell phone records placed him at the scene of the murders. Witnesses testified that they'd seen Balfour driving Jason's white SUV shortly after the killings. Most damningly, Balfour had made statements to other inmates while in jail awaiting trial, admitting to the murders and expressing no remorse. But perhaps the most crucial witness was Julia Hudson herself. Julia had to take the stand and testify about her relationship with Balfour, about the warnings she'd ignored, about the protection order she'd violated by continuing to let Balfour have contact with her family. Her testimony was emotional and painful, as she was forced to confront her own role in creating the circumstances that led to her family's destruction. Julia testified that she'd known Balfour was dangerous, but had convinced herself that maintaining some relationship with him was necessary for Julian's sake. The classic reasoning of abuse victims who prioritize keeping the peace over protecting themselves and their loved ones. She admitted that she'd let Balfour into her mother's home multiple times despite the protection order and despite her mother's explicit objections. She described threats Balfour had made and violence she'd witnessed, all while acknowledging that she'd downplayed these incidents to her family. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys tried to suggest that Julia herself might have been involved in the murders or that she'd set Balfour up. But prosecutors effectively demolished these theories, demonstrating that Julia's only crime was tragically poor judgment and an inability to recognize the true depth of danger Balfour posed. The most heartbreaking testimony came from family members describing Julian King. The 7-year-old had been a bright, happy child who loved sports and video games. He'd been close to his grandmother Darnell and his uncle Jason, both of whom had doted on him. He'd been excited about 2nd grade and had recently made the honor roll at his elementary school. His life had been full of promise and potential, all stolen by a man who viewed the child as nothing more than a tool for revenge against his estranged wife. On May 11, 2012, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury found William Balfour guilty on all counts. When the verdicts were read, Jennifer Hudson, who'd attended every day of the trial, broke down sobbing. Julia Hudson sat stone-faced, her expression a mixture of vindication that Balfour had been convicted and ongoing guilt over her role in enabling his access to her family. During sentencing, multiple family members gave victim impact statements. Jennifer Hudson spoke about her mother's love and strength, her brother's kindness and humor, and her nephew's joy and innocence. She described the permanent hole left in their family and the pain that would never fully heal. She asked the judge to impose the maximum possible sentence. Julia Hudson also gave a statement, one of the most painful pieces of testimony in the entire case. She apologized to her family for not listening to their warnings about Balfour. She expressed remorse for the choices that had led to tragedy. She acknowledged that her desire to maintain some connection with Balfour, whether for Julian's sake, out of misplaced loyalty, or because she hadn't fully understood the danger, had cost her mother, brother, and son their lives. She would carry that guilt forever. Judge Charles Burns sentenced William Balfour to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 120 years for the kidnapping and home invasion charges. He stated from the bench that Balfour's crimes were among the most heinous he'd encountered in decades on the bench, noting that Balfour had shown absolutely no remorse and had killed a 7-year-old child in cold blood. William Balfour is currently incarcerated at Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois. He continues to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He will never be released from prison. Julia Hudson has lived with the consequences of her choices ever since that terrible October day in 2008. While she's not a murderer herself, William Balfour is solely responsible for pulling the trigger. Her decisions created the circumstances that allowed the murders to happen. Her refusal to fully cut ties with Balfour, her violations of the protection order, and her dismissal of her family's warnings all contributed to the tragedy. In the years since the murders, Julia has largely stayed out of the public eye. She's reportedly struggled with depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and profound guilt. The psychological burden of knowing that her mother, brother, and son might still be alive if she'd made different choices is almost unimaginable. The case highlighted several critical issues related to domestic violence and family safety. First, it demonstrated how protection orders are only as effective as they're enforced. Julia had a legal order keeping Balfour away from her and her family, but she violated it herself by maintaining contact with him. This undermined the protection the order was meant to provide. Second, the case showed how dangerous it can be when family members ignore warning signs about abusive partners. Darnell Donnerson had recognized Balfour's dangerousness immediately, but her daughter had dismissed her concerns. This pattern repeats itself in domestic violence cases across the country. Family members see danger, issue warnings, but the victim either can't or won't take action to protect themselves and their loved ones. Third, the Hudson Family Murders demonstrated that domestic violence doesn't end when a relationship ends. In fact, the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims is often when they're trying to leave the relationship. Balfour's violence escalated specifically because Julia had moved on with her life, triggering his possessive rage. The Southside Chicago community where the murders occurred was devastated by the loss. Darnell Donnerson had been a respected member of the community, known for her kindness and her dedication to her family. Jason Hudson was remembered as a hard-working young man with a bright future. And Julian King was mourned as yet another young Chicago child whose life was stolen by senseless violence. A memorial service for the 3 victims drew thousands of mourners, including many who'd never met the family but felt connected to their tragedy. The service celebrated Darnell's strength, Jason's promise, and Julian's innocence, while also serving as a community expression of grief and solidarity with the surviving Hudson family members. In the aftermath of the murders, Jennifer Hudson established the Julian D. King Gift Foundation in her nephew's memory. The foundation provides support for families affected by violence and works to create positive opportunities for children in underserved communities. It stands as a living tribute to a little boy whose life was cut short, but whose memory continues to inspire positive change. The Hudson Family Murders remain one of Chicago's most notorious crimes, not because of the celebrity connection, but because of the senseless brutality and the preventable nature of the tragedy. 3 lives were stolen by a violent criminal who never should have had access to his victims. And while Julia Hudson isn't a murderer, her choices serve as a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of ignoring danger signs and prioritizing the wrong things when it comes to family safety. Julian King would be in his early 20s now if he'd lived. He'd potentially be in college, starting a career, falling in love, building a life. Instead, he's buried in a Chicago cemetery alongside his grandmother and uncle, 3 generations of the Hudson family destroyed in a single act of evil that could have been prevented if only the danger had been taken seriously soon enough. Case 6. Jennifer Freeman, the Quincy drowning. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. In the historic Mississippi River town of Quincy, Illinois, a community known for its scenic river views and close-knit neighborhoods, May 9, 2009 brought a tragedy that would challenge residents' assumptions about maternal love and protection. Jennifer Freeman, a 28-year-old mother of 3, drowned her 6-year-old daughter Madison in the bathtub of their home, a crime that revealed a dark pattern of abuse and a mother's complete lack of empathy for her own child. Jennifer Freeman's path to murder began long before that fatal May Day. Born in 1981 in rural Illinois, Jennifer had a troubled childhood marked by instability and neglect. Her own parents were teenage parents who struggled with substance abuse, and Jennifer spent portions of her childhood in foster care. She dropped out of high school at 16 and had her first child at 18, beginning a cycle of early motherhood and economic instability that would define her adult life. Jennifer had 3 children by 3 different fathers, none of whom remained consistently involved. Her eldest son was born when she was 18, followed by Madison 3 years later, and then her youngest daughter when Jennifer was 25. The family moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for the children to develop stable friendships or for teachers to build relationships with them, a pattern that allowed Jennifer's abuse to go undetected for years. Because what neighbors and authorities would discover after Madison's death was that Jennifer Freeman had been abusing her daughter for years. Madison bore the brunt of her mother's anger, frustration, and cruelty in ways that her siblings were partially spared. Jennifer singled Madison out for punishment, blame, and mistreatment that went far beyond normal parental discipline. Friends and relatives later testified that Jennifer frequently made disparaging remarks about Madison, calling her stupid, worthless, and the reason my life is terrible. She blamed Madison for relationship failures, financial problems, and any other difficulty in her life. When asked why she treated Madison differently than her other children, Jennifer couldn't provide a coherent explanation. She just claimed that Madison had always been difficult and made her angry. The reality, as child psychologists later explained, was that Jennifer had targeted Madison for abuse through no fault of the child's own. Sometimes abusive parents fixate on one particular child, projecting their own failures and frustrations onto that child and treating them as a scapegoat for all their problems. Madison had done nothing to deserve her mother's hatred. She'd simply been unlucky enough to become the focus of Jennifer's rage. By the spring of 2009, Jennifer's abuse of Madison had escalated significantly. Neighbors occasionally heard screaming from the Freeman apartment, but in their working-class neighborhood where many families struggled, people were reluctant to interfere in what they assumed were discipline issues. Madison's teachers at her Quincy elementary school noticed that she often came to class with bruises, that she seemed withdrawn and anxious, and that she flinched when adults raised their voices or made sudden movements. The school filed multiple reports with Illinois' Department of Children and Family Services, but investigations consistently concluded that while Jennifer was a struggling single mother, there wasn't sufficient evidence of abuse to remove the children. Jennifer was skilled at explaining away bruises, at presenting herself as overwhelmed but trying her best, and at convincing caseworkers that she was making improvements. Madison was too frightened of her mother to disclose the full extent of the abuse during interviews. On May 9, 2009, something pushed Jennifer over the edge. What exactly triggered her final act of violence remains unclear. Jennifer has given multiple contradictory explanations over the years. What is clear is that on that Saturday afternoon, while her 2 other children were outside playing, Jennifer ordered Madison to take a bath. Madison, who was 6 years old and in 1st grade, complied with her mother's order. She went to the bathroom, filled the tub, and got in. Jennifer followed her daughter into the bathroom, and what happened next was nothing short of murder. According to Jennifer's own later statements, which varied in detail but were consistent in the basic facts, she held Madison's head under the bathwater until the child drowned. Madison struggled, fought, tried desperately to breathe, but Jennifer was far stronger. The drowning took several minutes, meaning Jennifer had ample time to stop, to reconsider, to let her daughter live. Instead, she held Madison underwater until the child's struggles ceased and she went limp. After Madison died, Jennifer pulled her daughter's lifeless body from the tub and carried it to Madison's bedroom. She dressed Madison in pajamas and laid her in bed, positioning her as if she were sleeping. Then Jennifer went about her day, making dinner for her other two children, watching television, acting as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until the next morning, May 10th, that Jennifer called 911 claiming that Madison wouldn't wake up. When paramedics arrived, they immediately knew something was wrong. Madison's body showed clear signs that she'd been dead for many hours, with rigor mortis already setting in. When medical personnel attempted to assess the situation, they noticed that Madison's hair was still damp and that there was water in her ears, inconsistent with Jennifer's claim that Madison had simply failed to wake up. Emergency responders immediately called police. Detectives arrived and began questioning Jennifer, whose story quickly fell apart. She claimed Madison had taken a bath the previous evening and had seemed fine when she went to bed. But when pressed on specifics, she couldn't maintain consistent timelines or explain the physical evidence that contradicted her narrative. Within hours, police had arrested Jennifer Freeman on suspicion of murder. A search of the Freeman home revealed disturbing evidence of long-term abuse. Madison's room was stark and barren compared to her siblings' rooms. She had few toys, few personal belongings, and her mattress was stained with urine, suggesting she'd been too frightened to leave her room at night, even when she needed to use the bathroom. Medical examination of Madison's body revealed multiple bruises in various stages of healing, scars consistent with cigarette burns, and evidence of chronic malnutrition despite the household having adequate food for the other children. The autopsy confirmed that Madison had died from drowning and that the injuries to her body indicated ongoing physical abuse. The medical examiner estimated that Madison had suffered abuse for at least 2 to 3 years before her death, possibly longer. As detectives dug deeper into the Freeman family situation, they uncovered a horrifying pattern of cruelty toward Madison while her siblings were treated relatively normally. Jennifer fed Madison less than her other children, often giving her meager portions or stale food while preparing adequate meals for her son and younger daughter. She punished Madison for minor infractions with disproportionate severity, sometimes locking her in her room for entire days. She regularly told Madison that she was worthless and that Jennifer should have given her away when she was born. Neighbors, teachers, and even Jennifer's own relatives came forward with stories about Madison's mistreatment. One neighbor recalled seeing Jennifer yank Madison by the hair across the apartment parking lot while her other children walked normally beside her. A teacher remembered Madison coming to school with visible handprint bruises on her arms and Jennifer explaining it away as Madison falling. A relative recalled a family gathering where Jennifer served everyone else food but made Madison sit at the table and watch without eating as punishment for some perceived misbehavior. The question everyone asked was, why Madison? Why did Jennifer abuse this particular child while treating her other two children differently? Psychologists who evaluated Jennifer suggested multiple possible explanations. Madison may have reminded Jennifer of someone she resented, perhaps Madison's father or even Jennifer herself. Madison may have had a personality or temperament that Jennifer found difficult. Or Jennifer may have simply needed a scapegoat for her own failures and frustrations, and Madison had been unlucky enough to be chosen for that role. Whatever the psychological explanation, the legal reality was straightforward. Jennifer Freeman had systematically abused her daughter for years before finally murdering her. The prosecution charged her with first-degree murder, and given the evidence of premeditation and the history of abuse, they sought the maximum possible sentence. Jennifer's trial took place in Adams County Circuit Court in 2010. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of guilt. They showed the jury photographs of Madison's body, documenting the scars, bruises, and signs of malnutrition. They called teachers who described Madison's fearful demeanor and obvious abuse. They presented Jennifer's constantly changing statements to police, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. Most powerfully, they called Madison's older brother to testify. Now 11 years old, he described watching his mother treat Madison cruelly for years. He admitted that he'd sometimes participated in teasing Madison because his mother encouraged it, and he expressed profound guilt for not having protected his sister. His testimony painted a picture of a household where abuse was normalized and where Madison had been isolated even within her own family. The defense attempted to argue that Jennifer suffered from mental illness and that Madison's death had been the result of a momentary loss of control. They brought in psychiatric experts who diagnosed Jennifer with depression and claimed she'd been in a dissociative state when she drowned Madison. But prosecutors demolished this defense by demonstrating the long history of calculated abuse, the premeditation involved in ordering Madison to take a bath while sending the other children outside, and Jennifer's efforts to cover up the murder afterward by staging the scene and lying to authorities. On June 15, 2010, the jury found Jennifer Freeman guilty of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Jennifer showed no emotion, the same lack of empathy that had characterized her treatment of Madison throughout the child's short life. During sentencing, the prosecution presented victim impact statements from Madison's teachers, from neighbors who'd known the little girl, and from Madison's father, who hadn't been consistently involved in her life, but was devastated by her death and guilt-ridden over not having protected her. They described Madison as a sweet, gentle child who tried desperately to win her mother's love but never succeeded. They talked about Madison's drawings, pictures of families where the little girl figure was always separated from the others, reflecting Madison's understanding that she was different, excluded, unwanted. Judge Robert Adrian sentenced Jennifer Freeman to 50 years in prison, describing her crimes as a betrayal of the most fundamental obligation of motherhood. He noted that Madison had suffered years of abuse before her murder and that Jennifer had shown no remorse or empathy for her daughter's suffering. While 50 years wasn't a life sentence, given Jennifer's age, she would be in her late 70s before becoming eligible for parole, effectively ensuring she'd spend the majority of her remaining life behind bars. Jennifer Freeman is currently incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. She's now in her early 40s and has served over 14 years of her sentence. She's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. Her 2 surviving children were placed with relatives and have reportedly received therapy and support services, though they struggle with trauma from their childhood and guilt over Madison's death. The Quincy community was shocked by Madison's murder and the revelations about her abuse. Many residents felt guilt that warning signs had been present but not adequately addressed. Madison's elementary school implemented new training for teachers on recognizing and reporting child abuse, and the local DCFS office faced scrutiny over why multiple reports hadn't resulted in intervention before Madison's death. A memorial service for Madison drew hundreds of mourners. Her first-grade class released balloons in her memory, and her teachers read poems the little girl had written about wanting to be loved and wanting her mommy to be happy. These poems, preserved in Madison's school file, were heartbreaking testaments to a child who tried desperately to please an unpleasable parent and who died without ever knowing unconditional maternal love. Madison Freeman is buried in Quincy's Greenmount Cemetery. Her small gravestone reads, Madison Freeman, beloved daughter, gone too soon, forever 6 years old. Visitors sometimes leave stuffed animals or flowers, honoring the memory of a little girl whose short life was marked by suffering, but whose death sparked important conversations about child protection and maternal abuse. The Freeman case is particularly disturbing because it involved sustained, long-term abuse rather than a single moment of violence. Jennifer didn't just kill Madison in an impulsive act. She tortured her daughter for years before finally ending her life. The case raises troubling questions about how abuse can persist despite multiple reports to authorities, about how abusive parents can manipulate systems designed to protect children, and about the particular horror of parental scapegoating where one child is singled out for cruelty. Child welfare advocates point to Madison's case as an example of systemic failures. Multiple reports had been filed, multiple investigations had been conducted, yet Madison remained in an abusive home until it was too late. Reforms have since been implemented in Illinois to try to improve how DCFS responds to repeated reports about the same family, though advocates argue that resource limitations and overwhelming caseloads continue to prevent adequate protection of vulnerable children. For those who knew Madison, her teachers, her classmates, the neighbors who sometimes saw her playing alone, her loss remains painful decades later. They remember a quiet, sad little girl who deserved love and protection but received neither from the person who should have been her greatest advocate. Madison Freeman's short life stands as a reminder that some of the greatest dangers children face come not from strangers, but from their own parents, and that vigilance and intervention are sometimes necessary to prevent the ultimate betrayal of maternal trust. If you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell for true crime silent files. Covering these cases is emotionally difficult but necessary. These victims deserve to be remembered, and these stories need to be told. Your support through likes, comments, and subscriptions helps us continue this important work.
Case 7. Karen Heckel, the Naperville poisoning. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. Sometimes evil hides behind the most ordinary facades. In the affluent Chicago suburb of Naperville, a community that consistently ranks among America's safest and most desirable places to live, Karen Heckel presented herself as the ultimate devoted mother. She homeschooled her children, was active in her church, and was known throughout her neighborhood for her meticulous care of her family. But behind this facade of maternal perfection, Karen was slowly poisoning her 2-year-old daughter, Riley, in a calculated scheme that medical professionals describe as one of the most disturbing cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy ever documented in Illinois. Karen Marie Heckel was born in 1976 in suburban Chicago. By all accounts, she had a relatively normal middle-class upbringing. No obvious trauma, no significant hardships, nothing that would obviously explain the monster she would become. She was described by childhood friends as quiet and studious, if somewhat attention-seeking. She went to college, earned a degree in education, and seemed destined for a conventional life. Karen married her husband, David Heckel, in 2000, and the couple settled in Naperville where David worked as an accountant. They had their first child, a son named Connor, in 2002, followed by Riley in 2006. To neighbors and friends, the Heckels seemed like the ideal family, financially stable, actively involved in their church, and devoted to their children. But shortly after Riley's birth, Karen began exhibiting disturbing behavior that would eventually expose her true nature. She became obsessed with Riley's health, constantly claiming the baby was sick and taking her to doctors for various complaints. At first, medical professionals assumed Karen was simply an anxious first-time mother. Connor had been healthy and rarely needed medical attention. But as Riley's illnesses continued and intensified, doctors began to suspect something more sinister was occurring. Riley was constantly sick. She suffered from unexplained vomiting, diarrhea, lethargy, and seizures. By the time she was 18 months old, she'd been hospitalized dozens of times. Medical specialists ran countless tests, searching for the underlying condition causing Riley's symptoms. They tested for metabolic disorders, genetic abnormalities, immune system problems, and more. But every test came back negative or inconclusive. Riley appeared to have a mysterious illness that baffled the medical community. Karen threw herself into the role of devoted mother caring for a critically ill child. She started a blog documenting Riley's health struggles, garnering sympathy and support from her online community. She organized fundraisers for Riley's medical expenses. She accepted donations and prayers from church members. She homeschooled Connor so she could dedicate more time to Riley's care. She presented herself as a mother heroically coping with the unimaginable challenge of having a chronically ill child. But some doctors were becoming suspicious. Riley's symptoms only seemed to occur when Karen was present. When nurses or other family members cared for Riley, the child improved dramatically. When Karen returned, Riley's condition deteriorated. This pattern was inconsistent with any known medical condition, but highly consistent with a disturbing phenomenon called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder where a caregiver, usually a mother, deliberately causes or fabricates illness in someone under their care, typically a child. The most concerning behaviors came from Dr. Emily Martinez, a pediatric gastroenterologist at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, where Riley had been treated multiple times. Dr. Martinez had noticed that Riley's symptoms didn't fit any recognizable pattern, and that the child seemed to improve whenever Karen left the room. She'd also observed Karen's behavior during hospitalizations and noticed something disturbing. Karen seemed almost pleased when Riley got worse. She appeared energized and engaged when doctors were concerned about Riley, but seemed disappointed when the child showed improvement. Dr. Martinez consulted with hospital administrators and child protection teams. They made the difficult decision to install a hidden camera in Riley's hospital room during one of her admissions in the spring of 2008, when Riley was 2 years old. What the camera captured was shocking and provided incontrovertible evidence of Karen's crimes. The footage showed Karen, when alone with Riley, deliberately tampering with the child's feeding tube to cause vomiting. She was seen injecting something into Riley's intravenous line that caused the child to have seizures. Most horrifyingly, she was recorded suffocating Riley with a pillow until the child lost consciousness, then calling for nurses and claiming Riley had stopped breathing on her own. Armed with this video evidence, hospital administrators immediately contacted the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services and the Naperville Police Department. On April 14, 2008, Karen Heckel was arrested at the hospital and charged with aggravated battery of a child and attempted murder. Riley was taken into protective custody and placed with relatives. The investigation that followed revealed the shocking extent of Karen's abuse. Medical records showed that Riley had been hospitalized 87 times in her first 2 years of life. She'd undergone numerous invasive procedures and tests, many of them painful and traumatic. She'd been subjected to multiple surgeries for conditions that doctors now realized had been fabricated or induced by Karen. The child had spent more time in hospitals than in her own home. Forensic analysis of Riley's medical records, combined with the video evidence, proved that Karen had been systematically poisoning and harming her daughter. She'd injected fecal matter into Riley's feeding tube to cause infections. She'd administered medications that induced vomiting and diarrhea. She'd contaminated 4 lines to cause fevers. She'd suffocated Riley multiple times to create episodes where the child appeared to stop breathing. Every crisis in Riley's short life had been deliberately manufactured by her own mother. But why? What would drive a mother to torture her own child in this way? Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Karen suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a severe personality disorder where the perpetrator craves attention, sympathy, and validation they receive from being seen as a dedicated caregiver to a sick person. Karen was addicted to the attention she received as the brave mother, caring for a critically ill child. She loved the sympathy from friends, the admiration from her church community, the special status she achieved in medical settings. Riley wasn't a beloved daughter to Karen. She was a prop, a tool for obtaining the attention and validation Karen craved. The disorder is related to factitious disorder imposed on another and has been compared to a perverse form of addiction. Karen needed increasing doses of attention, which required Riley to be increasingly sick. As doctors struggled to find diagnoses and treatments, Karen escalated her abuse to create more dramatic symptoms. She was willing to torture and potentially kill her own child to maintain her role as the sympathetic mother of a sick child. Karen's trial began in DuPage County Circuit Court in the fall of 2009. Prosecutors presented the hospital surveillance footage, which was so disturbing that several jurors were visibly shaken while watching. Medical experts testified about the extent of Riley's suffering and the permanent damage caused by Karen's abuse. The child had developed post-traumatic stress disorder from her traumatic medical experiences, had significant developmental delays from prolonged illness and hospitalization, and would require extensive therapy for years to come. The defense attempted to argue that Karen was mentally ill and not responsible for her actions. They presented psychiatric testimony about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and suggested that Karen needed treatment rather than punishment. But prosecutors effectively countered this argument by demonstrating the calculated, premeditated nature of Karen's abuse. She'd researched medical conditions, carefully covered her tracks, and deliberately deceived dozens of medical professionals over 2 years. This wasn't the behavior of someone incapable of understanding their actions. It was the behavior of a skilled manipulator engaging in sustained, intentional abuse. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Karen's blog, which prosecutors presented to the jury. Reading Karen's posts about Riley's battles with her mysterious illness, knowing that Karen herself was causing every symptom she described, was chilling. She'd written eloquently about the pain of watching her child suffer, about the sleepless nights worrying about Riley's health, about the emotional toll of having a sick child. But it was all lies. Karen had been the one causing Riley's suffering, and she'd been glorying in the attention her blog generated. The blog entries also revealed Karen's narcissism and her view of Riley as an object rather than a person. She wrote far more about her own feelings and experiences than about Riley as an individual. She described herself as a warrior mom, fighting for her child, positioning herself as the hero of the story. The trial testimony revealed that Karen had been researching how to monetize her blog, potentially planning to profit financially from Riley's suffering as her online following grew. On November 12, 2009, the jury found Karen Heckel guilty on all charges, including attempted murder and multiple counts of aggravated battery of a child. When the verdicts were read, Karen finally showed emotion. Not remorse or shame, but shock and anger that she'd been caught and convicted. During the sentencing phase, Riley's father, David Heckel, gave a devastating victim impact statement. He described being completely fooled by Karen, never suspecting that his wife was deliberately harming their daughter. He expressed profound guilt for not recognizing the abuse sooner and for initially believing Karen's explanations about Riley's health problems. He revealed that his marriage to Karen had ended and that he was seeking sole custody of both children. He asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence to ensure Karen could never harm another child. Medical professionals who treated Riley also testified during sentencing, describing the emotional toll of watching a child suffer from what they believed was a terrible disease, only to learn that the child's own mother had been the cause of her suffering. Several doctors broke down while testifying, admitting that they'd been completely deceived by Karen and expressing guilt that they hadn't recognized the abuse sooner. Judge George Bacallis sentenced Karen Heckel to 35 years in prison, 20 years for attempted murder, and 15 years for child battery, to be served consecutively. He stated from the bench that Karen's crimes represented a perverse betrayal of maternal duty, and that she'd subjected Riley to unimaginable suffering to satisfy her own pathological need for attention. Karen Heckel is currently serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. She's now in her late 40s and will be eligible for parole in 2033 when she's 57 years old. She's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. In prison, She's reportedly continued to seek attention and sympathy, claiming to other inmates that she's been wrongfully convicted. Riley Heckel, now in her late teens, was adopted by relatives after her father's parental rights were terminated when he admitted he'd failed to protect her from Karen's abuse. She's undergone years of physical and psychological therapy. Medical professionals have worked to help her understand that her childhood illness was actually abuse and that she's not actually sick. This cognitive reframing has been crucial for Riley's recovery, though she continues to struggle with medical trauma and fear of healthcare settings. The psychological damage from Karen's abuse extends beyond the physical harm. Riley was trained from infancy to believe she was sick and fragile. She'd internalized the identity of the sick child and had to unlearn these beliefs as she recovered. She'd also bonded with her mother, the person who was simultaneously loving her and torturing her, creating profound psychological confusion that has required extensive therapy to address. Connor Heckel, Riley's older brother, has also struggled with the aftermath of his mother's crimes. He'd witnessed some of Karen's behavior, but had been too young to understand what he was seeing. As he grew older and learned the truth, he grappled with guilt, anger, and confusion about his mother. The medical community was also deeply affected by the case. Munchausen syndrome by proxy cases are notoriously difficult to identify because the perpetrator is often highly intelligent, medically sophisticated, and skilled at deception. Karen Heckel had fooled dozens of experienced medical professionals for 2 years. The case led to increased training for healthcare providers about recognizing signs of medical child abuse and implementing protocols for suspected cases. The case also sparked discussion about the ethical issues involved in surveillance of patients and families. The hidden camera that captured Karen's abuse had been controversial, some arguing it violated patient privacy rights, others contending it was necessary to protect a vulnerable child. Courts ultimately ruled that the surveillance had been justified given the strong suspicions of abuse and the inability to protect Riley through other means. Karen Heckel's blog remained online for several months after her arrest before being taken down. Before its removal, the blog became a case study in how perpetrators of Munchausen syndrome by proxy use social media to cultivate attention and support. Karen had built a community of followers who'd been emotionally invested in Riley's health journey, creating a feedback loop that reinforced Karen's abusive behavior. The Naperville community, already shocked by the Marilyn Lemak case just a few years earlier, struggled to comprehend how another mother in their safe, affluent suburb could commit such heinous crimes against her own child. The case shattered assumptions that abuse only happens in economically disadvantaged families or among the uneducated. Karen Heckel was college-educated, middle-class, and living in one of America's wealthiest suburbs, proof that evil can exist anywhere and wear any face. Today, Riley is living a life free from her mother's abuse, though the scars, both physical and psychological, remain. She's a survivor of one of the most insidious forms of child abuse imaginable, being systematically tortured by the person who should have been her greatest protector, also that person could receive attention and sympathy. The case of Karen Heckel stands as a stark reminder that maternal evil doesn't always look like anger or violence. Sometimes it looks like devotion, like sacrifice, like love. Sometimes the most dangerous mother is the one who appears most dedicated, most concerned, most willing to do anything for her child. Because beneath that facade of maternal perfection can lurk a monster willing to torture her own child for nothing more than attention and sympathy. Riley Heckel survived, but her childhood was stolen by her mother's psychological disorder and narcissistic craving for validation. In that sense, even though she lived, Riley too is a victim of maternal murder, the murder of her healthy childhood, her sense of safety, her ability to trust. And that betrayal, perhaps, is one of the most evil forms of maternal violence imaginable. Case 8, Sharon Mabry, the Chicago South Side Strangulation. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. Chicago's South Side has long been plagued by violence, much of it stemming from gang activity, poverty, and systemic inequality. But on June 22, 2013, a different kind of horror emerged, one that had nothing to do with street crime or gang warfare and everything to do with a mother's descent into addiction and rage. Sharon Mabry, a 39-year-old mother of 5, strangled her 9-year-old daughter Aaliyah to death in their home on South Calumet Avenue. When police discovered the crime, they also found Sharon's 4 other children locked in bedrooms, malnourished and traumatized, living in conditions that investigators described as among the worst they'd ever encountered. Sharon Mabry's life trajectory sadly followed a pattern common among many who end up committing terrible crimes. Childhood trauma leading to adult dysfunction, mental health issues, substance abuse, and ultimately violence against the vulnerable. Sharon was born in 1974 to teenage parents on Chicago's South Side. Her childhood was marked by instability, with her parents' relationship characterized by domestic violence and substance abuse. Sharon was in and out of foster care throughout her youth, never experiencing the consistent, loving parenting that forms the foundation of healthy development. As a teenager, Sharon became pregnant at 15 and had her first child at 16. Without education, job skills, or family support, she struggled from the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, she had 4 more children by different fathers. None of the fathers remained consistently involved, and Sharon increasingly turned to alcohol and drugs to cope with the overwhelming stress of single parenthood and poverty. By her late 30s, Sharon was addicted to crack cocaine, a drug that had devastated communities across Chicago's South Side. Her addiction consumed her life, leaving little room for the responsibilities of motherhood. The children, ranging in age from 9-year-old Aaliyah down to 3-year-old twins, were often left to fend for themselves while Sharon was either using drugs or attempting to obtain money for her next fix. The family's situation deteriorated rapidly in the months before Aaliyah's murder. Sharon had lost her housing assistance due to drug use violations, and the family was essentially squatting in an apartment on South Calumet Avenue. There was no running water, no electricity, and little food. The children wore clothes that were filthy and ill-fitting. They rarely attended school, with Sharon claiming she was homeschooling them, but providing no actual education. Neighbors occasionally heard children crying or saw them playing outside unsupervised, but in a neighborhood where poverty and hardship were common, where many families struggled with basic necessities, the Mabry children's situation didn't stand out as dramatically as it might have elsewhere. The few times concerned neighbors called authorities, Sharon managed to convince caseworkers that the situation was temporary and improving, or she simply wasn't home when they visited and follow-up was inconsistent. 9-year-old Aaliyah had begun to take on a parental role in the family, caring for her younger siblings as best she could. She tried to find food, tried to keep the younger children clean and safe, tried to shield them from the worst of their mother's addiction and neglect. Teachers at the school Aaliyah occasionally attended described her as a bright, responsible child who clearly carried burdens far beyond her years. But Aaliyah's attempts to keep the family together and care for her siblings apparently sparked conflict with Sharon. According to statements from the surviving children, Sharon resented Aaliyah's attempts to boss her around and saw the 9-year-old's responsible behavior as criticism of her own failures as a mother. This resentment built over time, fueled by Sharon's drug-addled paranoia and inability to take responsibility for her actions. On June 22, 2013, that resentment exploded into lethal violence. According to the surviving children's testimony, Sharon had been using drugs all day and was paranoid and agitated. Aaliyah had asked for food for her younger siblings, and when Sharon told her there was no food, Aaliyah had suggested they go to a community center that provided meals for children. This reasonable suggestion apparently triggered Sharon's rage. Sharon began screaming at Aaliyah, accusing her of being ungrateful and thinking she was better than everyone. The argument escalated, and Sharon grabbed Aaliyah by the throat. What began as an assault quickly became murder as Sharon strangled her daughter, her hands around the 9-year-old's throat for several minutes, until Aaliyah stopped struggling and went limp. The other 4 children witnessed their sister's murder. The eldest surviving child, a 7-year-old, later testified that he tried to pull his mother off Aaliyah, but was too small and weak to make any difference. The other children screamed and begged Sharon to stop, but she ignored them until Aaliyah was dead. After killing Aaliyah, Sharon dragged her daughter's body into a bedroom and covered it with blankets. Then she locked the 4 surviving children in another bedroom, threatening them that if they told anyone what had happened, she would kill them too. She left the apartment, telling the children she was going to get drugs and would be back later. The children remained locked in that bedroom for 3 days with their sister's body decomposing in the next room. They had no food, no water, and no ability to escape or call for help. By the time police finally discovered them, they were severely dehydrated and malnourished, traumatized beyond measure by witnessing their sister's murder and then being left alone with her corpse. Police discovered the situation on June 25 when the building's landlord, who'd been trying to evict the Mabry family, entered the apartment and smelled the unmistakable odor of decomposition. He called 911 immediately. Officers arrived to find a scene that veteran police described as one of the most horrifying they'd encountered in their careers. The apartment was in conditions of extreme squalor. Feces and trash covered the floors. There was no functioning plumbing or electricity, and the overwhelming smell of decay filled the air. When police broke down the locked bedroom door, they found 4 terrified, filthy children huddled together. In the adjacent room, they found Aaliyah's body, covered in blankets, with visible strangulation marks on her neck. The children were immediately taken to Comer Children's Hospital where they were treated for dehydration, malnutrition, and various infections caused by the unsanitary living conditions. Social workers and child psychologists began the difficult work of helping the traumatized children process what they'd experienced. Sharon Mabry was located the following day in a crack house several blocks away from her apartment. She'd spent the 3 days since Aaliyah's murder using drugs, apparently unconcerned about the children she'd left locked in the apartment with their dead sister. When arrested, she initially denied everything, then claimed she didn't remember what had happened. As evidence mounted, she finally admitted to killing Aaliyah but claimed it had been an accident, that she'd only meant to discipline her daughter and hadn't intended to kill her. But forensic evidence contradicted Sharon's claims. The medical examiner determined that strangulation deaths require sustained pressure for several minutes. This wasn't a momentary loss of control, but a sustained, deliberate act of violence. The presence of petechial hemorrhaging in Aaliyah's eyes and the severity of the injuries to her throat indicated that Sharon had applied significant force over several minutes. This was murder, not an accident. Sharon was charged with first-degree murder, child neglect resulting in death, and multiple counts of child endangerment for the surviving children. The prosecution built an overwhelming case demonstrating that Sharon had deliberately killed her daughter and then left her other children to potentially die in the locked bedroom. The trial took place in Cook County Circuit Court in 2014. Prosecutors presented medical evidence about Aaliyah's death, forensic evidence from the apartment showing the deplorable conditions, and most devastatingly, testimony from the surviving children about witnessing their mother murder their sister. The 7-year-old's testimony was particularly powerful and heartbreaking. Speaking through tears, he described how Aaliyah had always tried to take care of him and his siblings, how she'd shared her food with them even when there wasn't enough, how she'd told them stories to help them fall asleep when they were scared. He described watching his mother strangle Aaliyah and being powerless to stop it. He talked about the 3 days locked in the bedroom, not knowing if anyone would ever find them, growing weaker and more frightened with each passing hour. Child welfare experts testified about the chronic neglect and abuse the children had suffered, not just in the days surrounding Aaliyah's murder, but throughout their lives. They'd been failed by their mother, by absent fathers, and by systems that should have protected them but hadn't intervened effectively. The defense attempted to portray Sharon as a victim herself, of poverty, of addiction, of inadequate mental health resources and social support. They argued that she suffered from severe depression, post-traumatic stress disorder from her own traumatic childhood, and drug-induced psychosis. They presented Sharon as someone who'd needed help but hadn't received it, culminating in a tragic loss of control. But prosecutors argued forcefully that while Sharon's circumstances were difficult, thousands of women face similar challenges without murdering their children. They emphasized that Sharon had made choices at every turn, choosing drugs over her children's welfare, choosing to neglect her children rather than seek help, and ultimately choosing to strangle her 9-year-old daughter rather than accept the child's reasonable request for food. They argued that sympathy for Sharon's circumstances couldn't excuse or minimize the horrific nature of her crimes. On September 18, 2014, the jury found Sharon Mabry guilty of first-degree murder and all related charges. When the verdicts were read, Sharon collapsed in tears, wailing and claiming she didn't deserve to be punished because she'd been sick and needed help. But for the prosecution and for Aaliyah's devastated extended family members, justice had finally been served. During sentencing, several of Aaliyah's teachers provided victim impact statements, describing a bright, caring child who deserved so much better than the life she'd been given. They talked about Aaliyah's potential, how she loved reading, how she dreamed of becoming a teacher herself so she could help other children. They described the light that had gone out when this resilient, compassionate 9-year-old was murdered by the person who should have been protecting her. Aaliyah's paternal grandmother, who'd had limited contact with the family due to Sharon's drug use and instability, delivered an emotional statement in which she expressed profound guilt for not having done more to intervene. She described trying to maintain contact with her grandchildren, but being repeatedly blocked by Sharon. She talked about the last time she'd seen Aaliyah, just weeks before her death, and how the child had hugged her tightly and whispered that she wished she could come live with her. That moment haunted her. If she'd pushed harder, if she'd gone to authorities, might Aaliyah still be alive? Judge Vincent Gahn sentenced Sharon Mabry to 55 years in prison, 50 years for first-degree murder, and 5 years for child endangerment, to be served consecutively. He stated that Sharon had not only killed Aaliyah, but had tortured her other children by forcing them to witness the murder and then locking them up with their sister's decomposing body. Her crimes were among the most depraved he'd encountered on the bench. Sharon Mabry is currently serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Now in her early 50s, she's participated in addiction recovery programs and mental health treatment during her incarceration. She's reportedly expressed remorse for her actions, though whether this remorse is genuine or simply a product of sobriety and therapy remains unclear. She won't be eligible for parole until 2068, when she'll be 94 years old, effectively a life sentence. The 4 surviving Mabry children were placed with relatives and have received extensive counseling and support services. They've made remarkable progress given the trauma they experienced, though all struggle with PTSD, attachment issues, and other psychological challenges. The eldest surviving child, now in his late teens, has spoken publicly about his experience in hopes of encouraging others to intervene when they suspect child abuse or neglect. He said that the 3 days locked in the bedroom with Aaliyah's body haunt him still, and he's dedicated his life to ensuring that other children don't suffer similar fates. The Chicago community, particularly on the south side where the Mabry family lived, was devastated by Aaliyah's murder. The case highlighted the intersection of poverty, addiction, and child welfare failures. Advocates argued that the system had failed the Mabry children long before Aaliyah's death, that with better addiction treatment resources, more effective child protective services, and greater community support for struggling families, the tragedy might have been prevented. But others pointed out that Sharon had been offered help repeatedly and had consistently refused it or failed to follow through. She'd been connected to addiction treatment programs, but hadn't completed them. Social workers had provided resources and support, but Sharon hadn't utilized them. At some point, individual responsibility must be acknowledged alongside systemic failures. A memorial was held for Aaliyah at a Southside community center, attended by hundreds of people who'd never known her personally, but who were moved by her story. Teachers, neighbors, and child advocates spoke about the need to protect vulnerable children and to ensure that Aaliyah's death would lead to positive changes in how communities and systems respond to at-risk families. Aaliyah Mabry is buried in a small cemetery on Chicago's South Side. Her gravestone reads, Aaliyah Renee Mabry, Angel Too Soon, Forever 9, Forever Loved. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, stuffed animals, or children's books, honoring a little girl who loved reading and who dreamed of better things for herself and her siblings. The Mabry case is one of the most tragic examples of how addiction, mental illness, and poverty can combine to create conditions where terrible violence becomes possible. But it's also a stark reminder that being a victim of circumstances doesn't absolve someone of responsibility for their actions. Sharon Mabry may have been dealt a difficult hand in life, but ultimately she made choices, and those choices led to her daughter's death and her other children's trauma. 9-year-old Aaliyah Mabry should be in her early 20s now, perhaps in college, perhaps starting a career, hopefully living the better life she dreamed about. Instead, her life ended at 9 years old, strangled by her own mother's hands, her small body left to decompose while her traumatized siblings suffered just feet away. It's a horrific reminder that some of the most dangerous people in a child's life can be the ones who should love them most. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files if you haven't already. These stories are difficult to tell and difficult to hear, but it's crucial that we remember these victims and understand how such tragedies happen. Your engagement helps spread awareness about child protection issues and honors the memories of children like Aaliyah Mabry. Case 9, Stacey Schoeck, the drug-laced Gatorade. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. In the northern Illinois town of Wonder Lake, a small community of about 4,000 residents nestled among scenic lakes and forests, residents prided themselves on knowing their neighbors and looking out for one another. It was the kind of place where children rode bikes freely through neighborhoods and parents felt secure letting their kids play outside unsupervised. But on February 11, 2012, that sense of security was shattered when Stacey Schoeck murdered her 14-year-old son Alex by poisoning him with a lethal dose of prescription drugs hidden in his Gatorade. Stacey Lynn Schoeck was born in 1973 in the Chicago suburbs. By all accounts, she had a relatively typical middle-class upbringing and showed no obvious signs of the darkness that would later emerge. She attended college briefly but dropped out to marry her high school boyfriend, Michael Schoeck, when she became pregnant at age 21. Their son Alex was born in 1997, and for the first several years, the family appeared relatively stable. But cracks in the facade began appearing early. Stacey struggled with the responsibilities of motherhood and marriage. She became pregnant again when Alex was 2 years old, giving birth to a daughter, but the increased demands of caring for 2 children overwhelmed her. Friends and family later recalled that Stacey often complained about how difficult parenting was, how she felt trapped by her children, and how she wished she could go back to before and live her life differently. The Schoeck marriage deteriorated over the years, characterized by frequent arguments and periods of separation. Michael worked long hours as a sales representative, often traveling for days at a time, leaving Stacey as the primary caregiver. She resented this arrangement and began making increasingly disturbing comments about her children being burdens and obstacles to her happiness. By the time Alex entered middle school, the family situation had become untenable. Michael and Stacey separated, with Michael moving out and the children remaining with Stacey in the family home in Wonder Lake. A contentious custody battle ensued, with both parents seeking primary custody. Michael presented evidence of Stacey's neglectful parenting and her inappropriate comments about the children, but Illinois family courts at the time typically favored maternal custody, and Stacey was granted primary physical custody, with Michael having visitation rights. This custody arrangement enraged Stacey. Despite having complained for years about the burdens of motherhood, she viewed the custody case as a personal attack and became obsessed with winning against Michael. She began to see the children not as individuals she needed to care for, but as pawns in her battle with her ex-husband. And as the custody dispute continued, Stacey's behavior toward Alex became increasingly hostile and abusive. Alex, by all accounts, was a typical teenage boy. He loved video games, played soccer, and was doing reasonably well in school despite the turmoil of his parents' divorce. He was closer to his father than his mother, a fact that Stacey resented deeply. When Alex expressed a desire to live primarily with his father, Stacey's resentment turned to rage. In the months leading up to Alex's murder, Stacey made disturbing statements to friends about how her life would be so much better if she didn't have the children. She complained that Michael only wanted custody to avoid paying child support, that the children were ruining her life, and that she sometimes wished they'd just disappear. Most chilling, she told one friend that she felt like she was stuck unless something drastic happened to change her situation. What no one fully understood at the time was that Stacey was planning murder. She'd begun researching how various prescription medications could be fatal in high doses. She had access to multiple prescription drugs, some prescribed to her for anxiety and depression, others she'd obtained from friends or purchased illegally. She'd learned that certain combinations of benzodiazepines and other sedatives could cause respiratory failure if taken in sufficient quantities. On February 11, 2012, Stacey put her plan into action. It was a Saturday, and Alex's 12-year-old sister was spending the night at a friend's house, meaning Stacey would be alone with Alex. That afternoon, Stacey prepared a bottle of Gatorade, Alex's favorite sports drink, and laced it with crushed pills. The deadly cocktail contained a massive overdose of alprazolam, diazepam, and oxycodone, more than enough to kill an adult, let alone a 14-year-old boy. Stacey called Alex downstairs and handed him the poisoned Gatorade, telling him she'd bought it for him as a treat. Alex, having no reason to suspect his own mother would try to kill him, drank the entire bottle. Within 20 minutes, he began feeling drowsy and told his mother he was going to lie down. Stacey helped him to his bedroom and watched as the drugs began to take effect. Over the next several hours, Alex drifted in and out of consciousness as the massive overdose suppressed his respiratory system. At any point, Stacey could have called 911, could have induced vomiting, could have sought help to save her son's life. Instead, she sat in the next room, checking on Alex periodically to monitor his deterioration. She watched her son dying and did nothing to save him. By evening, Alex had stopped breathing. Stacey checked his pulse, confirmed he was dead, and then waited. She waited hours before calling 911, wanting to ensure that enough time had passed that resuscitation would be impossible. When she finally made the call around 11 o'clock that night, she claimed she'd just checked on Alex and found him unresponsive. She played the role of panicked, distraught mother perfectly, screaming and crying when emergency responders arrived. But paramedics immediately suspected something was wrong. Alex's body was already cool to the touch, suggesting he'd been dead for several hours, not minutes. There was no sign of trauma or injury, and the boy had been healthy with no known medical conditions. When they asked Stacey when she'd last checked on Alex, her timeline didn't make sense. She claimed she'd looked in on him just an hour earlier and he'd been fine, but the physical evidence contradicted this. Police were called to the scene, and detectives began investigating what appeared to be a suspicious death. They questioned Stacey extensively, and her story quickly began falling apart. She changed details, contradicted herself, and couldn't explain obvious inconsistencies in her timeline. Most suspicious, she seemed more concerned with establishing that she'd done nothing wrong than with grieving her son's death. An autopsy revealed massive amounts of multiple prescription drugs in Alex's system, levels that were clearly lethal and that could only have resulted from deliberate administration of a large quantity of pills. The toxicology report showed concentrations consistent with consumption within hours of death, matching the time frame when Stacey had given Alex the Gatorade. Detectives executed a search warrant on the Schoeck home and found damning evidence. Stacey had multiple prescription bottles with pills missing. Her computer search history revealed that she'd been researching lethal drug doses, methods of administering drugs without detection, and even how long it takes for someone to die from a drug overdose. They found the empty Gatorade bottle in the trash, and testing revealed drug residue inside. On February 14, 2012, just 3 days after Alex's death, Stacey Schoeck was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. When confronted with the evidence, she initially denied everything. But as the case against her became overwhelming, she finally admitted that she'd given Alex the drugs but claimed it was to help him sleep because he'd been having trouble with insomnia. She insisted she hadn't meant to kill him, that it was a tragic accident. But investigators and prosecutors knew this was a lie. The sheer quantity of drugs, the research on Stacey's computer, her behavior in the hours after Alex lost consciousness, and her deliberate delay in calling for help all proved premeditation and intent to kill. This wasn't an accident. It was calculated, cold-blooded murder. The trial took place in McHenry County Circuit Court in 2013. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Stacey's guilt. They showed the jury Stacey's computer search history, demonstrating that she'd been planning Alex's murder for weeks, if not months. They presented testimony from forensic toxicologists explaining that the drug levels in Alex's system were so high that death would have been inevitable, and that Stacey, who'd researched these medications extensively, would have known this. Michael Schoeck testified about Stacey's increasingly disturbing statements about the children and her obsession with the custody battle. He described receiving a call from police informing him that his son was dead and the horror of learning that Stacey had murdered him. He broke down on the witness stand, describing Alex as a kind, funny, bright boy who'd loved his father and who'd been looking forward to spending more time with him. Michael expressed profound guilt for not having fought harder for full custody, for not recognizing the danger Stacey posed, for not protecting his son. Alex's friends testified about what a good person he'd been. Loyal, funny, always willing to help others. His soccer coach described him as a dedicated player who'd shown real promise. His teachers talked about his academic progress and his plans to attend college someday. All of these testimonies painted a picture of a normal, healthy teenage boy whose life had been full of potential and promise until his own mother stole it from him. The most devastating evidence was a series of journal entries prosecutors found in Stacey's bedroom. In these entries, written in the weeks before the murder, Stacey had detailed her hatred of Alex, her resentment of Michael, and her fantasy of being free from her children. She'd written about how people would sympathize with her if something happened to Alex, how Michael would be devastated, and how she could start over without the burden of motherhood. These entries revealed a woman so consumed by selfishness and rage that she was willing to murder her own child. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to mental illness. They presented psychiatric experts who testified that Stacey suffered from severe depression and borderline personality disorder. They suggested that her judgment had been impaired and that she hadn't fully understood what she was doing. But prosecutors effectively demolished this defense by pointing to the extensive premeditation, the careful planning, and Stacey's attempts to cover up her crime, all demonstrating that she'd understood exactly what she was doing and had made a conscious choice to murder her son. On August 22, 2013, the jury found Stacey Schoeck guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict came after just 5 hours of deliberation, suggesting the jury had little difficulty reaching its conclusion. When the verdict was read, Stacey showed no emotion, staring straight ahead with a blank expression that had characterized much of her trial demeanor. During the sentencing phase, Michael Schoeck delivered a powerful victim impact statement. He told the court that Stacey had not only murdered Alex, but had also destroyed his daughter's childhood by taking away her brother and her sense of family security. He described the ongoing trauma both he and his daughter experienced, knowing that someone they'd loved and trusted had been capable of such evil. He asked the judge to impose the maximum possible sentence, stating that Stacey had forfeited any right to mercy when she watched their son die, without lifting a finger to help him. Alex's sister, now 13 years old, also provided a statement read by a victim advocate. She described the pain of losing her brother and the horror of knowing their mother had killed him. She talked about the nightmares she had, the fear that her mother might have killed her too if circumstances had been different, and the guilt she carried for not having been home that day to potentially save Alex. She said she would never forgive her mother and hoped she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Judge Sharon Prather sentenced Stacey Schoeck to 55 years in prison. She stated from the bench that Stacey's crime represented the ultimate betrayal of the parent-child relationship, and that the evidence showed a calculated, cruel murder motivated by selfishness and rage. The judge noted that Stacey had shown no genuine remorse, and that her attempts to portray herself as a victim were insulting to her son's memory. Stacey Schoeck is currently serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Now in her early 50s, she's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. She's reportedly continued to maintain that she didn't intend to kill Alex, and that she's been wrongly convicted, showing a continued inability to accept responsibility for her actions. Alex's sister has grown up in the care of her father, having undergone extensive therapy to address the trauma of her brother's murder. Michael Schoeck has become an advocate for father's rights in custody cases, arguing that courts need to take seriously any evidence that a parent poses a danger to children, regardless of gender. He's spoken publicly about the warning signs he'd observed in Stacey's behavior and his regret that the family court system hadn't given sufficient weight to his concerns. The Wonder Lake community was devastated by Alex's murder. The small town had prided itself on being a safe, family-friendly place, and the idea that a mother could murder her own child in such a calculated way shattered residents' sense of security. Alex's middle school held a memorial service attended by hundreds of students, teachers, and community members. His soccer team retired his jersey number, and a bench was installed at the local park in his memory. The case sparked significant discussion about custody disputes and parental fitness evaluations. Advocates argued that Alex's death might have been prevented if the family court had conducted more thorough psychological evaluations of both parents before awarding custody. They pointed to Stacey's documented statements about resenting her children and her history of making threats, arguing that these should have been taken more seriously as warning signs. Others noted that the case illustrated how some parents view children not as individuals deserving of love and protection, but as possessions or pawns in adult conflicts. Stacey hadn't killed Alex because she was psychotic or unable to distinguish right from wrong. She'd killed him because she viewed him as an obstacle to her desired lifestyle and as a way to hurt her ex-husband. This cold calculation made her crime particularly chilling. The Schoeck case is also notable for the method of murder. Poisoning is often called the coward's weapon because it allows the killer to avoid direct, violent confrontation with their victim. Stacey didn't have to look Alex in the eye as she killed him. She simply handed him poisoned Gatorade and waited for the drugs to do their work. This method also required extensive premeditation and planning, undermining any claims that the murder was impulsive or accidental. Child safety advocates have pointed to Alex's case as an example of why adults need to take seriously any concerning statements or behaviors from parents, even when those parents are educated, middle class, and seemingly functional. Stacey Schoeck looked like a normal suburban mother from the outside, but her statements about her children and her behavior during the custody dispute had contained warning signs that, in retrospect, clearly indicated she posed a danger to her children. Alex Schoeck is buried in a cemetery near Wonder Lake. His gravestone features a soccer ball and reads, Alexander Michael Schoeck, beloved son and brother, forever 14, forever in our hearts. His father and sister visit regularly, as do some of Alex's former friends and teammates who've never forgotten him. Today, Alex would be in his late 20s, perhaps graduated from college, perhaps starting a career or family of his own. Instead, his life ended at 14, poisoned by his own mother who decided that her convenience mattered more than his life. He spent his last hours losing consciousness in his own bedroom, unaware that the woman who should have protected him had instead chosen to murder him. The Schoeck case stands as one of Illinois' most disturbing examples of maternal filicide because of its premeditated, calculated nature. Stacey Schoeck didn't kill in a moment of rage or during a psychotic episode. She planned her son's murder carefully over weeks or months, researched the most effective method, and then executed that plan with chilling precision. Then she watched her son die, made no effort to save him, and attempted to cover up her crime by staging the scene and lying to authorities. It's a stark reminder that maternal evil can take many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in a child's life is the one who gave them life. Alex Schoeck trusted his mother, drank the Gatorade she gave him without hesitation, and paid for that trust with his life. And that betrayal, the deliberate destruction of a child's trust in their parent, may be one of the most evil acts a mother can commit. Case 10. Elżbieta Płatkowska, the Naperville apartment horror. Segment runtime, 2,000 words. We return to Naperville, Illinois, for our final case. A community that has appeared in this documentary multiple times, proving that even America's safest, wealthiest suburbs are not immune to maternal evil. On October 23, 2012, Elżbieta Płatkowska, a 40-year-old Polish immigrant and mother, brutally stabbed her 7-year-old son Justin to death and seriously injured a 5-year-old neighbor boy in an attack so savage that experienced investigators described it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they'd ever encountered. Elżbieta Płatkowska was born in 1972 in Poland during the final years of communist rule. She grew up in a working-class family in a small Polish town, where economic hardship and limited opportunities were the norm. As a young woman, Elżbieta dreamed of a better life, and when she met Marian Płatkowski, a Polish man who'd immigrated to the United States and was visiting family in Poland, she saw her chance. Elżbieta married Marian in the mid-1990s and moved to the Chicago suburbs, where Marian worked as a construction contractor. The cultural adjustment was difficult for Elżbieta. She spoke limited English, struggled to find work, and felt isolated from her family and the culture she'd known. She became pregnant shortly after arriving in the United States and gave birth to Justin in 2005, but motherhood didn't bring the fulfillment or joy she'd expected. Friends and family members later described Elżbieta as someone who'd always been somewhat odd, prone to superstitious beliefs, and convinced that evil forces were at work in the world. These tendencies intensified after Justin's birth. She became increasingly paranoid, claiming that demons were trying to harm her family, that evil spirits were entering their home, and that she needed to perform various rituals to protect her son. Marian dismissed his wife's beliefs as harmless cultural superstitions, not recognizing that Elżbieta was likely suffering from serious mental illness. He worked long hours and was often away from home, leaving Elżbieta alone with Justin for extended periods. During these times, Elżbieta's delusions intensified. She began to believe that Justin was possessed by demons or that he'd been replaced by an evil doppelganger. She performed bizarre rituals involving salt, religious items, and chanting, trying to cleanse her son of evil spirits. By 2012, Elżbieta's mental state had deteriorated significantly. She'd stopped taking Justin to his pediatrician for checkups because she feared doctors were part of the evil conspiracy. She homeschooled him, claiming the public schools were corrupted by demons, though she provided no actual education, instead spending days performing her protective rituals and ranting about spiritual warfare. Justin, who should have been thriving in second grade, was instead being raised in an environment of paranoia and delusion. The 7-year-old had become withdrawn and anxious, aware that his mother's behavior was abnormal, but lacking the understanding or ability to get help. He rarely left their apartment, had no friends, and spent most of his time trying to stay out of his mother's way during her increasingly frequent paranoid episodes. Marian, when he was home, tried to provide some normalcy, but he was largely oblivious to how severe Elżbieta's mental illness had become. On October 23, 2012, Elżbieta's delusions reached a catastrophic climax. She'd been awake for days, claiming she was standing guard against evil forces that were planning to attack. She'd covered the apartment's windows with sheets and religious imagery, claiming this would prevent demons from entering. She'd stopped eating, saying that food was poisoned, and had lost a significant amount of weight. Justin was terrified of his mother by this point, but had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. That afternoon, Elżbieta became convinced that Justin was possessed by Satan and that the only way to save his soul was to kill his physical body, releasing his spirit from demonic control. This delusional belief, unfortunately not uncommon in cases of maternal filicide involving severe mental illness, led Elżbieta to arm herself with multiple kitchen knives. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Elżbieta attacked 7-year-old Justin in their Naperville apartment. She stabbed him more than 100 times in a frenzied, brutal assault that lasted several minutes. The child tried desperately to escape, evidenced by defensive wounds on his hands and arms and blood trails showing he'd attempted to reach the apartment door. But Elżbieta pursued him relentlessly, continuing to stab him even after he'd collapsed. Justin Płatkowski died from massive trauma to his chest, abdomen, neck, and face, his small body bearing over 100 stab wounds. But Elżbieta's rampage didn't end with her son's death. Still in the grip of her delusional state, still convinced she was fighting a spiritual war against demonic forces, she left her apartment with knives still in hand and encountered a 5-year-old neighbor boy playing in the hallway. Elżbieta believed this child was also possessed or working for evil forces, and she attacked him as well. The 5-year-old sustained multiple serious stab wounds to his back, arms, and chest as he screamed and tried to escape. His screams alerted neighbors, who called 911 immediately. The commotion also brought other residents into the hallway, and several brave individuals physically subdued Elzbieta, wrestling the knives away from her and holding her until police arrived. Officers responded within minutes to find a nightmarish scene. The 5-year-old was rushed to Edward Hospital in critical condition with life-threatening injuries. Inside the Plakowski apartment, police discovered Justin's mutilated body. The crime scene was so disturbing, with blood covering walls, floors, and furniture, that multiple officers requested trauma counseling afterward. Elzbieta was taken into custody, covered in her son's blood. She made bizarre statements to police about having defeated Satan and saved souls from demonic possession. She showed no remorse or even clear understanding that she'd killed her own child, instead remaining fixated on her delusional beliefs about spiritual warfare. The 5-year-old neighbor survived his injuries after extensive surgery and a lengthy recovery. He'd been extraordinarily lucky. Several of Elzbieta's stab wounds had missed vital organs by millimeters. The physical scars would heal, but the psychological trauma of being randomly attacked by a neighbor would require years of therapy. Elzbieta Plakowska was charged with first-degree murder for Justin's death and attempted first-degree murder for the attack on the neighbor child. But her case immediately raised complex questions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the insanity defense. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Elzbieta suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness characterized by hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. Multiple experts agreed that at the time of the attacks, Elzbieta had been experiencing a full psychotic break and genuinely believed she was fighting demons. The question the legal system had to answer was whether her mental illness meant she couldn't be held criminally responsible for her actions. Marian Plakowski was devastated by his son's death and his wife's role in it. He told investigators that he'd known Elzbieta held unusual religious beliefs, but hadn't realized how severe her mental illness had become. He expressed profound guilt for not having recognized the danger and not having gotten Elzbieta help before tragedy struck. He lost his son and his wife in a single day, his family destroyed by unrecognized and untreated mental illness. The trial took place in DuPage County Circuit Court in 2014. It became a battle between competing views of criminal responsibility and mental illness. The defense argued that Elzbieta had been legally insane at the time of the murders, that she couldn't distinguish right from wrong due to her psychotic delusions, and that she should be found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a mental health facility rather than imprisoned. Prosecutors acknowledged that Elzbieta was mentally ill but argued that mental illness doesn't automatically equal legal insanity. They pointed out that Elzbieta had demonstrated some awareness of wrongdoing by attempting to hide evidence and by making statements suggesting she knew others would view her actions negatively. They argued that she'd had moments of lucidity where she could have sought help but chose not to. Most importantly, they emphasized that regardless of her mental state, she'd killed a 7-year-old child in an extraordinarily brutal manner and had nearly killed another child, and she posed an ongoing danger to society. The trial featured extensive psychiatric testimony from both sides. Defense experts described Elzbieta's delusions in detail, explaining how paranoid schizophrenia had completely distorted her perception of reality. They testified that she genuinely believed Justin was possessed and that killing him was a necessary act of spiritual warfare. They presented evidence that Elzbieta had no history of violence before this incident and that with proper medication and treatment, she could potentially be rehabilitated. Prosecution experts acknowledged Elzbieta's mental illness but argued that she'd retained enough connection to reality to understand that killing was wrong. They noted that she'd attempted to keep her actions hidden from Marian, suggesting awareness that others would disapprove. They pointed to moments where her behavior seemed calculated rather than purely delusional, such as her selecting knives as weapons and pursuing Justin when he tried to escape. The jury also heard heartbreaking testimony about Justin Plakowski. Teachers from the brief period when he'd attended public school described a sweet, quiet boy who'd seemed anxious and isolated. Neighbors recalled occasionally seeing him playing alone in the apartment complex, always looking sad. His father described a loving child who'd enjoyed playing with toy cars and watching cartoons, who'd been affectionate and kind despite the chaos of his home life. The medical examiner's testimony about Justin's injuries was particularly difficult. The more than 100 stab wounds indicated a prolonged, brutal attack. Justin had suffered defensive wounds, showing he'd tried to protect himself. The distribution of wounds across his body suggested he'd been attacked multiple times as he tried to escape, then attacked again after he'd fallen. The level of violence was extreme even for homicide cases, indicating the intensity of Elzbieta's psychotic rage. On July 25, 2014, after several days of deliberation, the jury found Elzbieta Plakowska guilty of first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. They'd rejected the insanity defense, determining that while Elzbieta was mentally ill, she'd retained sufficient awareness to be held criminally responsible for her actions. When the verdicts were read, Elzbieta showed little reaction, her expression blank and disconnected. She'd been medicated during the trial, stabilizing her psychotic symptoms but leaving her emotionally flat. Whether she fully understood what was happening remained unclear. During sentencing, Marian Plakowski gave a devastating victim impact statement. He described the impossibility of grieving for his son while also mourning the loss of his wife to mental illness. He expressed guilt for not recognizing how sick Elzbieta had become and anger at a mental health system that had failed to intervene before tragedy struck. He asked the judge to impose a sentence that would ensure Elzbieta received mental health treatment while also protecting society from any future violence. The 5-year-old victim's parents also provided statements, describing the ongoing trauma their son experienced from the random attack. They talked about his nightmares, his fear of leaving their apartment, and the extensive therapy he required. They emphasized that while they understood Elzbieta was mentally ill, their son's suffering was real and deserved justice. Judge Robert Miller sentenced Elzbieta Plakowska to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Justin's murder, plus an additional 40 years for the attempted murder of the neighbor child. He stated that while he acknowledged Elzbieta's mental illness, the severity of her crimes, and the ongoing danger she posed required a sentence that would ensure she never returned to society. Elzbieta Plakowska is currently serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where she receives mental health treatment and medication. Now in her early 50s, she's reportedly stabilized on antipsychotic medication and has expressed remorse for her actions, though it's unclear whether she fully comprehends the enormity of what she did. She will never be released from prison. The Naperville community was again shocked by maternal violence in their midst. Justin's death sparked intense discussion about mental health awareness, the challenges of identifying and treating severe mental illness, and the particular difficulties faced by immigrant communities where mental health stigma may prevent people from seeking help. A memorial service for Justin drew hundreds of mourners. His school, which he'd attended briefly before Elzbieta pulled him out, established a scholarship in his name for children of immigrants, honoring his memory while acknowledging the unique challenges faced by immigrant families. The Plakowska case raises profound questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. Unlike many of the other cases in this documentary where mental illness was used as a defense of convenience, Elzbieta Plakowska was genuinely, severely mentally ill. Multiple experts agreed she'd been experiencing psychosis during the attacks. Yet the jury still found her criminally responsible, reflecting society's belief that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences, regardless of mental state. The case also highlights the tragic consequences of untreated mental illness. Had Elzbieta received proper psychiatric care earlier, had her symptoms been recognized and addressed, Justin might still be alive. But mental illness is often invisible, especially in communities where stigma prevents people from seeking help or where language and cultural barriers make accessing care difficult. For the immigrant community in the Chicago area, particularly Polish immigrants, the case was especially painful. Many worried it would reinforce negative stereotypes about immigrants or Eastern Europeans. Community leaders emphasized that Elzbieta's actions were those of a severely ill individual, not representative of Polish culture or immigrant families in general. Justin Plakowski is buried in a cemetery in the western suburbs of Chicago. His gravestone, written in both English and Polish, reads, Justin Plakowski, beloved son, with the angels now, forever 7. Marion visits regularly, leaving toy cars, Justin's favorite, at the grave. Today, Justin would be in his late teens, perhaps preparing for college, perhaps discovering his interests and passions, building friendships, and planning his future. Instead, his life ended at 7 years old, murdered by his own mother in a psychotic frenzy, his small body bearing over 100 stab wounds inflicted by the person who should have protected him above all others. Closing segment. We've journeyed through 10 horrific cases of maternal evil in Illinois, each one a devastating reminder that the sacred bond between mother and child can be shattered by mental illness, addiction, selfishness, rage, or combinations of these factors. From Naperville's affluent suburbs to Chicago's struggling South Side, from small towns to urban centers, these tragedies have touched communities across Illinois, leaving scars that will never fully heal. These weren't accidents. These weren't tragic circumstances beyond anyone's control. These were deliberate acts of violence committed by mothers against their own children, the ultimate betrayal of the parental bond. Some of these mothers killed in rage, others in cold calculation. Some claimed mental illness, others blamed their victims. Some showed remorse, many showed none. But regardless of their motivations or their defenses, they all share one thing in common. They destroyed innocent lives, they devastated families, and they committed acts that stand among the most evil in Illinois' criminal history. The victims, Nicholas, Emily, and Thomas Lemak, Christopher, Austin, and Kylie Hamm, Jillian Vasilev, Brianna, and Brooklyn Dively, Julian King, Madison Freeman, Aaliyah Mabry, Alex Schoeck, Riley Heckel, who survived but lost her childhood, and Justin Plakowski. These children deserved love, protection, and the chance to grow up. Instead, they were betrayed by the very people who should have been their greatest advocates. If these stories disturb you, good. They should disturb you. These are real children who suffered real horrors at the hands of their own mothers. Their stories need to be told, their memories need to be honored, and the lessons from these tragedies need to be learned. If you found this documentary valuable and important, please hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our thoroughly researched deep dives into true crime cases. And please, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on these cases. Respectful discussion helps us process these difficult stories and honors the victims' memories. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of harming yourself or others, please reach out for help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7 at 1-800-2738-255. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is 1-800-4CHILD. Remember, evil doesn't always look like poverty or chaos. Sometimes it looks like a middle-class family in a safe neighborhood. Sometimes it wears the face of a devoted mother. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts when something seems wrong, and don't be afraid to intervene if you suspect a child is in danger. Thank you for watching this difficult but necessary documentary. Until next time, this has been True Crime Silent Files, reminding you that behind every crime statistic is a real person whose life mattered. These children's lives mattered. Their stories matter, and we'll keep telling them. Stay safe, everyone.